So thank you so much for being here. Welcome to this really workshop on giving democracy a new push in times of crisis. My name is Christine Neuhold, and I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, and we have several students here today, so that's great. And I'm also co-coordinator of this relay project together with Felix Ruiz-Cabré, who's running around as we speak. So welcome to this workshop, and what will we do today? So on the one hand, we're going to look at democracy. We're going to look at what has changed when it comes to democracy since the Maastricht Treaty, basically. But we are going to look at different things. We're going to look at different arenas, different channels of democracy. On the one hand, parliamentary democracy. And on the other hand, we're going to look at civil society and also the Conference of Europe. If you have followed EU affairs closely, you will see that there are many transformations when it comes, for instance, to the role that the European Parliament plays in European affairs. You will also see that civil society involvement has been enhanced over the years. But we want to take stock today of these developments, and we want to also have a look at whether crisis, and you all know, and we feel it every day, that the European Union, but not only the Union, we have faced a lot of crises over the past decades as well. And this has also been coined as a poly-crisis, several crises feeding into each other. We're not going to have an intellectual debate today about whether it's really a crisis and what is a crisis, but we're just going to look at where does democracy, and we have to put that in big inverted commas, but where does democracy stand today? And it is a great pleasure to have a wonderful lineup of speakers for this workshop, for this relay workshop, which is financed by the European Commission. And we have 6 workshops looking at the Commission priorities. And this is the 5th one. So we are looking at the democracy, giving democracy a new push. We've had other workshops on issues such as the environment, and we will still have another one on Europe and the world. But without further ado, I will move and go to the panel, and we're still missing one panelist, but we have to be flexible in times of crisis when we don't have everybody here. And I now have to look at my program. So the first panel is how do parliaments contribute to making the EU more democratic? It's in big inverted commas. I'm an academic, I'm aware that this is not a very scientific term in times of crisis. And we will have a kick-off statement. And we will start with Daniel Freund, member of the European Parliament for the Greens, EFA, and member of the Executive Board of the Conference on the Future of Europe. So we're also going to look today at the Conference on the Future of Europe and how it has enhanced citizen involvement. Daniel Freund, I would like to give you the stage.
Thanks. Well, thanks so much for inviting me for this very interesting question, I would say. When you look at parliamentary democracy at the European level, I think, whether you assess this as things are going well or things are going terrible always depends a bit on how far you zoom out. I think if you look at it from a historic point of view, the European Parliament has been getting better and better, more democratic, more powerful, has contributed to the functioning of European democracy more and more. Yet when you're in it as a member of Parliament, it's at times also quite frustrating to see how far we still are from being a normally functioning Parliament, right? That the most obvious thing is that we don't have the right of initiative. We don't have that one crucial power that every other parliament in the European Union actually has to suggest laws or to adopt the budget by ourselves. So I would say that particularly that fight with the council, it's not on an equal footing. On many decisions, it's still the council alone taking decisions that at the national level would naturally be taken in the parliament. And I would say that in times of crisis, particularly when decisions have to be taken quickly, it's not even in the questions. There was talk, usually then the decisions go more to the executive. I would say that in the European Union, decisions go more towards the council, because we have that bizarre, semi-executive, semi-legislature institution where the governments of the member states sit in the council. And we have seen that in the last few crises, during the COVID response, when it came to the financial response to that, quickly there was the idea of, this time around we're maybe not gonna make the recession even worse by saving lots of money into the recession, but that the European Union was going to invest, was going to try to do something against the economic meltdown. That worked, but that response, although the parliament discussed it and contributed to the discussion, the final decision was one taken by the member states. We had no say, and particularly we now have very little say in how those 750 billion euros actually get spent, how that happens precisely. Again, no role for, or little role, I would say, for the European Parliament. And we see it now as well in the response to the energy crisis. The member states are pulling, I think it's Article 121, if I'm not mistaken, but special procedure that allows the member states, when the energy market is sort of under severe pressure, that they can basically decide in an emergency procedure without giving the European Parliament any say. So, there is just a number of examples where we are circumvented. And while the European Parliament historically, as I said, has corrected some of this, we have gotten more and more powers where there's co-decision, but the most important questions remain ones of unanimity and decisions taken in the council. And our attempt to do something about that was basically the conference on the future of Europe, because our feeling was that, through the normal procedures and in our almost inexistent dialogue, let's say, with the council, we weren't really getting anywhere. There had been a number of reports in the European Parliament over the last few years where we suggested different potential treaty reforms and so on, but nothing happened, right? So then my idea, other members of the European Parliament's idea was, well, let's actually bring everyone into a room, because the European Union actually doesn't have a room where members of parliament, government representatives, the commission, national parliamentarians actually discuss. We only ever interact with the rotating presidency. They show up in our committees and in plenary, they present the program of their presidency, but we never talk to the council. Even in our legislative conversations, well, we negotiate with every 6 months with someone else, but with the rotating presidency. So even to know, does the presidency actually speak for themselves, or the majority, or to figure out when they make a point, is the diverging views in the room in the council is often quite some detective work. So we wanted to have a conference where everyone sits in the room, and where, well, I suggested very early on that we also have citizens and civil society in that conversation, because my view was that what had been done in Ireland with the citizens' assemblies, randomly selected citizens that deliberated on two topics, actually, I think are the strongest example, on marriage for all and on the right to abortion, topics that had been hugely controversial in Ireland for decades, but that thanks to the citizens' assemblies ultimately led to referendums that, more than 2/3 of Irish people ultimately supported what the citizens had suggested. Big success. So the idea was a bit, can we repeat that in Europe? Because, well, I and others felt that there's similar issues. If you ask Europeans, do you think that a company like Apple should pay more than 0.005% taxes on the billions that they earn in Europe? you get almost unanimity among European citizens that is probably a good thing to do. Yet it doesn't happen in reality, right? We're still not there. One of the reasons is the veto, and so we thought that a conference like that could maybe push that conversation. I'm going to stop here, and then you can ask me whether I think that worked successfully or not, or maybe the other speakers can talk about that. But I think there's some material to get us started.
Thanks so much for these kick-off statements. I always have to take the microphone because otherwise the online people will not hear us. So now it's a great pleasure to welcome Nathalie Brack, Associate Professor at the Department of Political Science, Université Libre de Bruxelles. And Nathalie has worked both on the European Parliament and especially on Eurosceptic parties. Of course, research always evolves, but that's what Nathalie's, for instance, very well known for. And also lately, you did a commission study by the European Parliament on the role of national parliaments. So what we're looking here now, after the kickoff statement by Daniel Freud, which gave us really excellent input into the thinking of how to bring together policymakers and citizens in one arena. So that was the conference on the future of Europe, but also, possibly rethinking the legislative setup of the European Union once again, with the European Parliament not having the right of initiative. Nevertheless, I find from an outsider's perspective, the European Parliament is an especially proactive parliament. So what the European Parliament has been able to do is to really, I don't want to say ignore legislative rules, but I want to say interpret legislative rules beyond the legal letter. So you've really tried to interpret that also creatively, which I think is a very, very important thing if you have limitations. I'm not trying to say at all that violation, I'm just saying creative interpretation. And also, finding ways of making these legislative rules work. For instance, when it comes, we talked with the students the other day, co-decision, the trilogues are not in the treaty, but they've become part and parcel of legislative decision-making. And I wonder how you could take decisions without this. So I think we see evolution, and we see also progress within the European Parliament, even if maybe the treaty rules are more constricted than they're interpreted into the practical process. So Nathalie, please, I asked you different questions, but I'm very interested which ones you will answer.
Well, I chose the first one, although it overlaps with what Daniel just said. So from a more academic perspective, I agree with you, so that the crisis shifted powers in the European Union in general. So we still have very much European Union, and we still need it. And there is still much more closer cooperation, partially due to the crisis. Because the global pressures need a global answer. But that's true that the intergovernmental institutions have taken the lead on most issues. So when we thought with the Lisbon Treaty, the parliaments are the winners of that treaty, we saw that with the crisis, it was not so much the case. So on the positive side, the EU institutions showed their resilience and adaptability, but on the negative side, the European Parliament was more limited politically and on salient files. So it was not a central player, I would say, of the last decade. And maybe the fact that the Parliament is looking now to come back to a role that he played very much before as a forum for ideas. Maybe it's a good idea, because on the legislative side, it has its own powers, and there is not much more that we can do there. It's a co-legislator, so of course there is still the right of initiative, but apart from that, the Parliament has its role to play, but politically to come back to its original function, I would say, of debates. That could be the way for the Parliament to assert itself again in the EU through the convention. But I was also positively surprised to see the results of the working group inside the Parliament on democracy within the Parliament, because for a long period of time, and I I wrote about it and I criticized a lot about it, saying the parliament wanted so much to have powers in the legislative arena that it focused so much on consensus inside. And so opposition from the inside was quite muffled. So, you don't have a lot to say because the parliament wanted to be united towards the commission, towards the council, in the trilogues and so on. And now there is this reflection inside the parliament of how to make the parliament more democratic on the inside. And when I was reading the reports of this working group inside the parliament to hold debates on Europe, on main issues, to put the spotlights on specific issues that could make the parliament also more visible for citizens and more understandable for citizens, I think it's a big issue for the parliament, and maybe the way forward to have more say politically in Europe today. But I can say a few things afterwards on national parliaments if you want.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm looking towards the organizers. I'm one of them, but I'm sitting here. Has Ian arrived? Yes. Ha. So Ian Cooper will join us in a second. He's coming through the back door.
Hi.
Good morning, Ian. We're not that early, but when you have to travel in from Ireland, it's sometimes tricky. We regret the times when we were able to sit in our pajamas behind the computer screen, but we're also very happy to be here live. So Ian, very nice to see you. You came just in time. We just had a discussion about the European Parliament, and also that the European Parliament is going back to its role as a forum of ideas, that the European Parliament has seized its powers, but that there is still more to do when it comes to extending the powers of the European Parliament. Ian Cooper is a research fellow from the Brexit Institute at Dublin University. And we have several students here with us today, and everybody has to read the virtual third chamber. National parliaments after the Lisbon Treaty, have they been turned into a virtual third chamber? What is the role of national parliaments, especially after the Lisbon Treaty? They have, again, if we look at the treaty, their powers have been extended. What use have they made of these powers? Are they actually a virtual third chamber? How has crisis impacted on the role of parliaments, national parliaments? Here, for instance, I know rather little as opposed to the European Parliament, what national parliaments have done, for instance, in the COVID pandemic, which is still with us today. So Ian, without much further ado, I would like to give you the opportunity to speak first.
Shall I use this? Can you hear me? Well, my intention today was actually not to talk about the virtual third chamber concept.
You don't have to.
But that was that I'm very happy to talk about in the Q&A, answer questions about it. But today I wanted to talk about Brexit, which is because the question that was given was how can parliaments respond to a Europe in crisis? And I include Brexit as part of that crisis. So Brexit, and Brexit is interrelated with all the many other crises that affected the EU in the last decade. Migration, rule of law, and the Eurozone crisis, all of these things, and they in particular exacerbated Brexit, but Brexit actually had some impact back on them. And so in thinking about how parliaments can respond to that, I'm interested in the question of interparliamentary cooperation after Brexit, and specifically interparliamentary cooperation between members of the British Parliament and members of the European Parliament or national parliaments in the European Union. So what mechanisms are there, what institutions are there to give British parliamentarians a voice, some kind of a voice in the halls of power in Brussels or Strasbourg or wherever national parliamentarians or European or the EP is meeting. And so this is an ongoing research program for me, and I've been looking into this and was speaking to people in the European Parliament yesterday about this, so cards on the table. If you remember, like our old, like the debates about the democratic deficit, the idea of the democratic deficit is that when citizens are unrepresented, when decisions are taken that affect some citizens, citizens that are, when decisions are taken and that affect citizens that have no say over those decisions, then you have a democratic deficit. And this is a perennial problem in the European Union as it affects states that are on its periphery, like, you know, Norway, like the EFTA countries, for example, Norway, Switzerland, etc. Now Britain is one of those states, and Britain is a much larger state than those states, and so Brexit suddenly has the effect of greatly exacerbating the democratic deficit, because it puts 66 million people in that position of being affected by the decisions of the EU without having any input over those decisions. Now, I think, again, cards on the table, I think Brexit was a really bad idea. I don't think I'm not in any way defending. I'm not in any way defending. I'm not, I'm not in any way defending the decision to vote for Brexit. But you know, even just think about the 48% of people in the United Kingdom who voted to remain. They're stuck now. They've been dragged out of the European Union against their will. So we have to think about them. We have to think about creating mechanisms that allow some kind of parliamentary deliberation, some kind of parliamentary oversight, where the British parliamentarians can have some kind of say over or some kind of say or some kind of look in over the decision-making processes in the EU. I was going to go into much more detail. Do I have time for all that?
So we're not on the time.
Okay.
So you want to still reflect a bit?
Okay. So I've been looking into this, right? And there are a number of different mechanisms. One is the interparliamentary conferences in the EU. The United Kingdom can send representatives to those conferences. So, and if you, COSAC is I'm seeing lots of nodding, so the people in the room are familiar with all of these. There are the COSAC CFSP, the SECG, which is the economic governance, Europol, Speakers Conference. Those are the five. So the United Kingdom, after Brexit, can send representatives to those conferences as special guests. That is something that has happened, but only sporadically. or actually there's a very distinctive pattern. And I checked this again recently. If you look at the list of attendees at all these conferences, the United Kingdom has representatives at all the COSAC meetings since Brexit, so since beginning of 2020. All the COSAC chairs meetings, all the COSAC plenary meetings, and all the meetings of the CFSP committees. All these meetings that happen every 6 months. Then the United Kingdom has sent representatives to all of those. But for the other committees, they've been attended either once or not at all. So I think there was one time there was a representative from the UK at the Europol, once at the SECG committee, and not at the speakers conference at all. So the United Kingdom has already made a choice. Now there's a little bit of ambiguity about the rights of the United Kingdom to attend these meetings. In general, they can attend them as a special guest, so they have to ask for an invitation. So unlike candidate countries, the candidate countries have an automatic right to attend these meetings as observers, but the UK has to ask for an invitation. But in general, they have asked for an invitation and they have been given an invitation, they attend. The exception is the CFSP conference, because the CFSP conference makes an exception that if a state is a European member state of NATO, has an automatic right to attend the CFSP conference as observers. And that applies to countries like Norway, and also obviously applies to the UK. So that's one channel. Other channels are, the interparliamentary conferences are one channel. Another channel is the kind of general parliamentary assemblies that are European parliamentary assemblies, like the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, the OSCE Assembly, the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. All of these are parliamentary assemblies for international organizations where the United Kingdom is also a member, and so they have obviously they have a right to send representatives to those assemblies, and in those assemblies they can meet other parliamentarians who are coming from EU member states. But of course, none of this in those institutions, they're not really talking about EU affairs, right? Their main purpose is to talk about the affairs of those particular institutions. So that does open up a possibility of some kind of networking where British parliamentarians can network with European parliamentarians, but it's not a great place to talk about specifically European Union affairs, unlike the European Union interparliamentary conferences.
So Ian, maybe wrap it up.
Okay, I've got two more.
Okay.
The other, I'll just touch on them briefly. There are specifically Irish parliamentary bodies. There are two that I'm thinking of that would allow British parliamentarians to liaise with Irish parliamentarians. One is the British-Irish Parliamentary Assembly, which is a meeting between the Parliament of the United Kingdom, the Parliament of the Republic of Ireland, and also including representatives of the devolved parliaments of the United Kingdom. So Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales. So there's a place where, and because there are so many issues coming out of Brexit that are specific to Ireland and Northern Ireland, that is a forum where parliamentarians can talk about these issues, that specifically kind of these post-Brexit issues, such as the Northern Ireland Protocol. And one more that I would mention is the North-South Parliamentary Association, Interparliamentary Association, which is a meeting between members of the Stormont Assembly, so the Northern Ireland Assembly, and the Irish Parliament, which is that hasn't met for many years because the Northern Ireland Assembly has been suspended for many years. So that is another possible meeting place for specifically members from that devolved assembly to meet with Irish members to talk about, and they could in that assembly talk about issues that are related to Brexit. But again, as I say, they haven't met for a number of years. And then finally, and this is the main point, this is the main kind of subject of my research going forward, is the Parliamentary Partnership Assembly, which is a new parliamentary assembly made up of members of the European Parliament and members of the British Parliament. And this is something that comes out of the Brexit deal, comes out of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, an agreement to create a Parliamentary Partnership Assembly that will meet twice a year. There'll be 35 members from the European Parliament and 35 from the British Parliament. 21 members on the British side, 21 members from the House of Commons and 14 from the House of Lords. Now, this body has met just once, and that happened in May, and they will meet again in early November. So the meeting in May took place in Brussels, and the meeting in November will take place in London, and they will continue to alternate between these two venues. So it will meet twice a year, once in Britain, once in Brussels. And the idea behind it is to give, it's in part to just give British parliamentarians a chance to kind of meet up with their European colleagues and talk about European issues. And to some extent, it has an oversight role with the Partnership Council, the body that is the joint EU-UK body that is supposed to be implementing the Brexit agreement. That's an executive body, and so this Partnership Assembly is, in a way, is the parliamentary body that's intended to oversee this council, this executive body. And just to be very, very short of it, to give you a very, very short summary of what happened at the first meeting of it in May, it was very, very contentious because there was simply no Maros Šefčovič was there, and he was visibly exasperated about the Northern Ireland Protocol, and the British representative was supposed to be Liz Truss, but she pulled out at the last minute, and she was represented by a junior minister from the Foreign Office. She was in the Foreign Office at the time, who basically just said the British line at the time, which was that, you know, we are carrying through with the Northern Ireland Protocol bill, and which is essentially would torpedo the withdrawal agreement. The Northern Ireland Protocol bill is a bill in the British Parliament that would essentially turn off parts of the Northern Ireland Protocol, so and thereby violate international law, and so that is it. So, and that's a major problem from the EU perspective. And so this partnership council, because the whole idea is that the UK and the EU are supposed to get together and agree on things, and then the Partnership Assembly is going to oversee how they are implementing those things together in partnership. But because there's no partnership, because they are fighting all the time, then it's unclear exactly what the role of the Partnership Assembly is supposed to be, because they're overseeing a body that is visibly and obviously divided. Okay. So
thank you so much for taking our discussion in a different direction, for looking at Brexit and the involvement of parliaments, and also giving us a glimpse of what was happening. I would, before we give the floor to the discussant and open the discussion, still like to come back to the two other panelists, so to Daniel Freund and Nathalie Brack. First of all, of course, feel free to come in from your experience on what Ian just told us. But I have a question still about, because you were there, during the COVID pandemic, and now also with the energy crisis. Yeah, so how do these, this polycrisis, this is a term that also former President Juncker from the Commission used. First of all, do you see, is this a term that's also used in the Parliament, the term of polycrisis? And how does this crisis actually, how does this impact on your work? So would like to have a little bit more of reflection on these issues.
I haven't heard the word polycrisis a lot, but I mean, we're all aware that, there is crisis after crisis. That, the way I look at the union, I haven't been doing this since forever, but since the financial crisis, then migration, then Brexit, then COVID, now the war in Ukraine, we haven't really been out of crises for many days in those years. So obviously, yeah, it shapes us. And I mentioned the examples, when we take decisions on the Corona Recovery Fund and now on the energy packages. Yet, since we have been continuously in crisis, it's also become a bit, business as usual. You cannot be on red alert every single day. Then it becomes the normal alert level, so to speak, right? I think still, I mean, you talked about how the European Parliament has interpreted its role in a creative way that gives us additional space to discuss ideas, to maybe even get some things through. But I have to say that I also see, the European Parliament is often, and I have to say I'm one of them, right? I ask for the European Parliament to have the right of initiative. I ask, for us to have a stronger role in decision-making processes, more competences. But it's also true that the Parliament hasn't always been good at really fighting for those things, because we could have the right of initiative tomorrow if we really wanted to. If we were willing to kick out the Commission and say, we're not going to accept a Commission anymore that doesn't do what the Parliament wants, we would have the right of initiative. We could have a say on the recovery fund if we were willing to fight that through till the end when we were in those negotiations. We could also have imposed a working Spitzenkandidaten system in the European Union if we would have stuck to the line that was agreed by all the political groupings in the European Parliament ahead of the last elections, that we would only elect a Spitzenkandidat, or at least you might say someone that has run in the European elections, that would still have given you a choice of how many were we at the time? Still 751 members of the European Parliament, right? But we do not always make use of that full power. Obviously, we're in constraints. Obviously, we also fear that, you know, if you overplay it, there might be popular backlash. You know, if you create institutional gridlock, at what point are Europeans going to say, do we still need that European Parliament thing that's just blocking everything? That's the gamble. But I'm also, you know, after the last European elections, for example, that we didn't even take a month more to figure out whether we could not find another solution than just voting von der Leyen into office. Maybe refusing her once, whether then you do the refusal a dozen times is a different question. But you know, those are quite kind of questions that I ponder when it comes to the role of the European Parliament.
And then I have an immediate follow-up question. So if the European Parliament could do this, why doesn't it do so? Is it because it's not a united, you know, because it's a different political grouping? So how do you see that?
Well, I think particularly after the election, it played a role that 2/3 of the members of the European Parliament were new. And I also still think that lots of members of the European Parliament do not really, you know, think of themselves as strong, independent members of Parliament. Also because the way that the lists are done and the elections work in some of the member states. I mean, look at France. Macron sits down in his office and draws up a list, and that's the list of La République En Marche. If you look at the Spanish Social Democrats, they feel that they're not necessarily, you know, their first task is not necessarily, I'm oversimplifying, right? But I have the impression that they feel that their first task is not necessarily to represent Spanish voters or Europeans in general, but to do the bidding of the Spanish Prime Minister in the European Parliament. I mean, the reason the negotiations among the four groups collapsed and that there wasn't a deal struck to vote Manfred Weber into office was that, well, both the Liberals and the Social Democrats changed their leadership. Both leaderships were under heavy influence from the French and the Spanish governments. And they sort of thought that they could get their own into the top chair. The Social Democrats wanted Timmermans, the Liberals, Margrethe Vestager. Well, and that all failed, and we got someone that didn't run in the election, and that was suggested by Macron. So he won that power struggle, if you want.
Thank you so much. I now also have a question for Natalie to come in on this crisis issue. Do you have from an academic point of view, do you have the feeling or the impression that the crisis, and you know, polycrisis is a fancy term, but indeed, as Daniel Freund pointed out, also us as citizens have not been out of crisis for a long time now. Do you have you studied this? Have you looked at this? To what extent has crisis impacted on the way decisions are taken, not only in Parliament, but more in the EU in general?
So yes, we studied also whether this polycrisis was different, because for some people, European Union was always in crisis and goes from crisis to crisis throughout its history. And a lot of people believe that it's out of crisis that Europe's grow, and it's partially true. However, the last decade was yet different in the sense that it's a lot. It's a succession of crises, and also the type of issues that were at the center of the crisis were also at the heart of European integration. When you think about the crisis of the Eurozone, okay, the shock came from abroad, from the US, but then it calls into question whether Europe is there to provide prosperity for its citizens, which is one of the aims of European integration. Then you had a first Ukrainian crisis, if you can call it like that, then the migration crisis, then the pandemic. and Brexit, of course. Then you have, like, again, discussion at the moment about differentiated integration and this idea of political community that comes, and in a way that crisis, all those crises just accentuated issues that were there before. So I wouldn't say that it was a massive change in European governance or in European politics. At one point, you have all those crises created pressure. So I think all the executives in Europe agree that, you know, we need closer cooperation and we need European integration to tackle those crises. But at the same time, one thing that changed was public opinion is more aware of what European integration is and what it does. And some categories of people see the effect of European integration as negative. Of course, the Brexiteers, but not just the Brexiteers. A lot of people who vote today for Eurosceptic parties are not convinced by the added value of European integration, or fear that, you know, in their daily life, the effect of Europeanization is negative to them. So you have this two trend that comes together. In a way, Europe showed again that it could come out of this crisis with new powers, new competences, although it's not the usual shift from, you know, the nation state to, for instance, supranational institution like the Commission. The role of the Commission is hotly debated now in the academic literature, whether it lost some powers or not. It's not clear. What is very clear is that intergovernmental institution came above the rest, and that the solution through the crisis came from the Council and the European Council. That's very clear effect of the crisis. At the national level, I would say national parliaments, it depends a lot on the national parliaments, but I would say the crisis increased the visibility of European issues for citizens, so that gave an incentive for some members of parliament, you know, to get involved in European politics, and to not dismiss it, or not to become more involved in general. But to make a link with what Daniel Freud said, that's true that one of the most important constraint nowadays for European democracies in those crises is that party politics in Europe is still stuck in the 20th century. It seems that it doesn't have changed through those crises, and the national level remains the main frame for those parties, the main context in which they act, and all those debates about Spitzenkandidat, about transnational lists, you see that, you know, there is still this reflex of national control about the list, whether it's the executive or whether it's the leader of the party, which is not in the executive, but it's still very much that reflex that they have. And I'm doing now an interview about what Euro parties can mean for European democracy in 24. And yeah, Euro parties, they have all the institutional structure is there, all the funding is there, but yet, yeah, but I mean, even there, you see the report that was adopted by the European Parliament. If I'm not mistaken, it was very much constrained by the Commission about what the Parliament could vote upon and what they could change. So the Parliament, again, it's crucial for the Parliament to have a say on Euro parties and democracy, and the Commission saying, well, you can change, you know, like a little bit. But yeah, Euro parties at this point, it doesn't play a major role in European election. That's national parties, and national parties are still very much against putting, for instance, people from other member states in their list, or agreeing at the European level about, you know, that's our view on Europe, on European policies, and we want people to have a say on all those big issues. And I would say that's one of the main issues for the next election and for democracy in Europe.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Freund, would you still like to come in here, or? Then, Ian, is there anything you would like to add before we give the floor to the discussant?
No.
Okay. So then to the audience, ask questions about the Conference of Europe, ask questions about national politics and European politics. Is it really intergovernmentalism that is the game of today? I wouldn't say so, but we've heard a little bit about that. And I think also in the academic debate, we're very much obsessed with winners and losers, but that's not a good debate. So it's very good to have a nuanced debate around the table as we just had. I would like to now give the floor to our discussant who has been working on these issues from many different perspectives, and all of you have been working on these issues or deal with these issues in the practical process. But Alvaro Olliat, it's his last day today as postdoctoral researcher at the Studio Europa Maastricht. We were together at the panel yesterday, but he's joining the ULB together with Natalie, so it's not a coincidence that they're sitting next to each other for a postdoctoral project. And Alvaro, on the one hand, and I still pronounce your name wrong, sorry, on the one hand has been very much involved in the conference on the future of Europe, because Studio Europa has also been involved there. But at the same time, you told me yesterday, you've also been working on national parliaments. You're also working on digital issues and impact on democratization, which is a very hot topic also for us at Maastricht University. So Alvaro, without much further ado, what do you make of what has been said around this table today?
Yeah, thanks so much, Christine, and it's an honor to share the panel with you all. So I'll be short, and maybe I'll just address you directly as a response to your respective input. So yeah, thanks a lot. I really enjoyed your kickoff statement, Daniel. And one of the things that I was thinking, because I followed very closely the conference on the future of Europe, and in the plenary sessions, there was the Commission component, the Council component, and then there were the European Parliament component and the national parliaments component. So following very closely and also having some interviews with national parliamentarians there, there was a bit of a disconnection between both the MEPs and the national parliamentarians. And I sense that there is maybe a broader pattern as well from my own research on how national parliaments tend to treat European issues, which mostly, well, they have a tendency towards avoiding it. So I was wondering if you see any potential towards more parliamentary cooperation between the European Parliament and national parliaments, and whether there is also willingness from both sides, because I do, as Natalie was saying before, that national parliamentarians tend to focus a little bit too much on the national level and forget the European level, but sometimes maybe it also goes the other way around. So yeah. Yeah, Natalie, thanks so much for your super interesting perspective. I really like this idea of the problematic unity of the European Parliament in some ways. And I was wondering if you could share some ideas of how to democratize the European Parliament internally. So yeah, because yeah, I thought that was very interesting.
Very easy task.
And yeah, thanks a lot, Ian, as well for your input. So I have two questions. The first one is whether you see some sort of possibility of a sort of teaming up of non-EU parliaments on EU issues. So you mentioned Norway, Switzerland. So whether the British parliamentarians will increasingly connect to those parliaments. And second, I mean, I was fascinated by this involvement as well as an observer in not me, like the British parliamentarians in all these committees. But my question is, will it really matter politically? Because even if in the EU already national parliaments often are to a certain extent disengaged with the EU, yeah, will it really matter what the involvement of these British parliamentarians that really have an effect? So yeah, thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you so much. I don't think I need the microphone. Down in front.
So on that first question with the national parliamentarians, I'm always a bit skeptical. You know, we have a European Parliament that is elected by Europeans on European election program that we all have, all the different parties, to solve European issues. So I'm not a strong believer that you need to create a third chamber, that you need to involve the national parliamentarians more, because, well, it's not what they were elected for. If you look at the last election in Germany for the Bundestag, you know, European issues figured little to none. 3 TV duels among the, you know, chancellor candidates, not a single question on Europe. I don't see how they have any stronger legitimacy to be present on European issues. Then it's often the case that in the Europe committees, the ones that show up for COSAC, the ones that show up for the Conference on the Future of Europe, well, it's the little few in those parliaments that have a fable for Europe. They don't always reflect sort of the majority view in the parliaments all that well. It doesn't really help, if you send a few Europhiles, but then back in the parliament, whatever large majorities think very differently than they do. So, I mean, obviously they have their role, but I would actually see that the thing that national parliaments really should do is hold their governments accountable when they sit in the council. And some parliaments do that much better than others. When in the Danish parliament, the Europe Committee sits on standby during summits. And, when the Danish government needs an indication, is it okay for us to do this deal or not? The committee is there to answer that question. They have access to all the information. In Germany, my party, the Greens, we had to sue in front of the Constitutional Court to actually get full access to what does the government do and know about European affairs. And there's still a lot of national parliaments that have no idea what their government does in council, what their leaders do at the summits. I think that's the job they should really be doing, rather than, red cards, green cards, all those kind of things, because, it's just too much. I think, honestly, it's too much. You can't be a national legislator and also be a European legislator at the same time. I mean, already I struggle as a European legislator to be on top of all the things that go through the European Parliament. The other question on, how to democratize the European Parliament. I actually think that if you look at those issues where we're very united from left to right, that's always the issues in a way where European democracy doesn't function. The constitutional changes is one of those areas that you find such broad majorities in the European Parliament for a convention. Basically shows that, we have worked have agreed on the lowest common denominator in the European Parliament. That's the reason why we can all agree on it. But it still doesn't happen. And these things get stuck in the council. And it's, on other issues as well. Basically, whenever you get a super broad majority in the European Parliament, shows you that European democracy is broken, but not in the Parliament. It's actually broken in the Council, because they block, take the asylum distribution mechanism, which, huge majority in the European Parliament. And for years and years, it does not happen, because usually individual, a very small, loud group of member states blocks it, and we have seen that on a number of issues. So I think the way to fix democracy in the European Parliament is to make sure that it works properly on the government side, that we get rid of national vetoes, for example. But then immediately the European Parliament will align again amongst ideological lines, if you want, and all those issues where we decide with majorities, on the Green Deal, for example, you see divisions, and you often see very tight votes, and you see loud discussions, and then it works.
Thanks so much. Ian?
Yes, so the question about non-EU parliaments getting together and looking at EU issues is actually a fascinating one, because the way that the European Union, your Parliament, relates about the relationship between non-EU parliaments and EU issues. The European Parliament, the way it relates to non-EU member states, is imperial, and I use that. It's like the British Empire, and I use that very, very advisedly, meaning that the way the British Empire related to each of its colonies was bilaterally. There was not kind of a general a general kind of wasn't a general kind of a collective role for different colonies. It was each of them had its own separate relationship with the British government. You look at the way the European Parliament relates to non-EU parliaments, then it is similar in that you have all these kind of bilateral committees, basically. In fact, the parliamentary partnership assembly, the relationship, the one between the European Parliament and the United Kingdom, is unusual because it's called an assembly. All the rest of them are called committees. So there's one with Ukraine. There's one with Moldova. There's one with, and it's not just member states it's not just neighboring states in Europe. That's also true of the United States, Canada, countries throughout the world. The European Parliament has a joint committee with each of these other parliaments. And for some reason that I have not been able to ascertain, they decided to call it an assembly in the case of the British group, but it's not, as far as I can tell, structurally different. If you look, and so if you're looking for a place where all the neighboring states can get together with the European states, well, it's COSAC, because in fact, if you look at a COSAC meeting, then at a COSAC meeting, you have all the member states, all the parliaments of the European Union member states. You have the European Parliament, you have the candidate countries, and then you have special guests. And who are the special guests? Norway, Switzerland, Moldova, Ukraine, which are now candidate countries, and the United Kingdom is also part of that group. North Macedonia, like all these different groups. But again, it's not a relationship of equality. All of these groups can attend, but they can attend as observers. And I remember I was at a COSAC meeting a number of years ago, and a visitor from one of the Eastern Partnership countries, I can't remember which one, asked to speak, and they actually were told that they can't speak because they said, sorry, we can't recognize you because you're just an observer. You're not here in a speaking capacity. And so again, it's an unequal relationship, and so there is no, if you're looking at kind of differentiated integration, there's no structural, and there ought to be a structural way for non-EU member states to meet with EU member states on the level of equality. And I also wanted to kind of comment briefly on what you said about national parliaments. I'm going to stick up for the notion, if not the notion of the virtual third chamber, at least the notion that national parliamentarians should have a role in European Union politics. You could say the same thing about the council, right? Like people don't elect like their national governments, the national ministers, and the European Council and the national leaders as to represent them at first and foremost, they represent them in domestic politics, and then second at the European politics. But that doesn't mean that they can't actually also speak on the European stage. And I would say the same thing about national parliamentarians. I need to draw to a close.
Thank you. Natalie?
Well, thank you, Alvaro, for this very easy question. So first of all, I'm not saying that, like the only problem in European democracy is European Parliament. Of course, the Council has a major role there. It's just that for me, parliaments have, inclusive the European Parliament, they have different functions. They have the oversight function, they have the legislative function, they have the deliberation function and the linkage function. And when I studied with a colleague the institutional reforms inside the European Parliament since the first European election, through the rules of procedure and so on, the focus of the Parliament, which understandably was on how do I increase my own power as an institution. So the members were focused on efficiency and on legislation, which makes sense considering the context. So that was all about how do we make the other institution, the Council and the Commission, hear the arguments of the European Parliament. But that came at the cost of the deliberation function and the linkage function. So the debates were very technical, led by experts, were mostly done in committees, so no implication from citizens there. And now, as far as I'm concerned, it seems that one of the effects of the context and of the crisis is maybe to give more attention to the idea of deliberation inside Parliament and to make the debates livelier, to constrain much less maybe the MEPs to take the floor to answer themselves, like the blue card that was introduced, like other aspects, or to have huge debate, to draw the attention on those debates from national media and European media. And we see also that mainstream parties are trying to connect better with their citizens at the national level. And at the last two elections, we were trying to put on the agenda European issues, which was not the case before, and to maybe increase the linkage. And there was a PhD thesis, for instance, recently showing that whereas before it was mainly Eurosceptic parties that were trying to make that linkage with citizens through the representation of territorial interests inside the European Parliament, or specific constituents or regions through their parliamentary question. Now, mainstream parties are also trying to do that and to increase the linkage between citizens and Europe, which I think it's positive in a way from that crisis. So for me, it's just that maybe by accentuating other function of parliaments, now that the legislative side, it's a bit more affirmed than in the 80s, that the parliament is going in the right direction.
Thanks so much. I would now like to, Ian, you will get the possibility to reflect on these issues, but I would now really linkage function, you just heard it, I would really like to have the audience and also give you the opportunity to ask questions to our excellent speakers, and we will collect questions. We'll see if we have to go for a second round, but it's always good to collect questions. So who has a question? I mean, collect, you have to have a question. Yeah. Okay, we have a lot of questions. So, and the microphone will be thrown around. And then you can say, get up and say who you are, so the panelists know.
Hi, good morning. My name is Annelies van Rijen, and I work at Studio Europa Maastricht together with Alvaro. It's your last day. I have a question about the Committee of the European Regions. And what is the role of the committee maybe in also closing maybe this democratic gap between the citizens on the regional level and European level? Thanks.
Thank you. Can we pass on the, what is it called? Microphone.
May I? Yeah, thank you. I'm Franco Perroni. I'm from Maastricht University, from the Faculty of Law, assistant professor there. I'd like to come back on the talk about the European Parliament. The sense that I see the European Parliament is kind of having a regress. If you look at 19th century history, all the parliaments started to be in a form of government that was with a double mandate with the king and the parliament itself. The government was depending on both. In time, they became full parliamentary governance. European Parliament looks like at a certain point it could have become a full parliamentary body, where 2014 election. And now it looks much more like a forum, like a place where to debate, very heated debate, but no more than this. So My question will be like, instead of insisting on the right to initiative, it's not the key point to actually enforce the right, or better, the power to get rid of a government, as any parliament has always done. If we think about parliamentary democracy in Germany, Italy, France, of course, most of the laws are proposed by the government. So it's not that the key point, but rather than that the parliament, well, Germany, Italy for sure, France, I think even more for the mechanism. So the point looks like the question of confidence, when the parliament, when the European Parliament is going to enforce it. Thank you.
I saw some other hands.
Yeah.
In the back. Always turn around. Yes.
Hello, I'm Alejandro. I'm a student at ULB, studying the specialized master in interdisciplinary studies. And my question is, what's like the main difference between the politics or the real politics from the European Parliament and from the parliaments, like the national parliaments, you know? Like here in the European Parliament, do they really follow like their party's ideology, or is more like a country ideology, or how does it work? That's like my question. Okay.
Thank you so much. Moving to the front.
Hello, everyone. I'm also a student from International Institute, European Institute on the specialized master. My name is Larissa, and I have one question regarding Brexit. Do you have a clear vision where is now position of Britain in comparison with candidates who will become candidates, or you are special guests as Norway or other countries? Do you have a vision where Britain will finish, let's say like that? And regarding European Parliament, I'm a bit curious how much and how a relationship between the members, do you represent more, let's say, the rights and interests of all European Union, or it's more focused on each country and your country of interest, or the special parties in the European Parliament? How much is it? I know on the paper how is it, but in real life, in real Parliament, what is it? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Are there any other questions? Yeah, we can do some answers and we'll go to the second round. Let's go to the answers. And you got a lot of questions on each one.
So first question, what do I think of the Committee of the Regions? I got to be honest, I don't think it works. Both the Committee of the Regions and the Economic and Social Committee, for me, we can abolish them. They were initially intended, you know, that they have a role as well. They get to say things. They sit together, they produce all kinds of reports that nobody reads and that have zero impact. So I think by now it's just fooling people that local authorities have a say. So I think I'd be honest and get rid of them.
Do you think they should have a say? This is your analysis.
I mean, they can have a say. They can express their opinions, and if they have a valid point, I'm sure they're going to be heard. But in the current, you know, they make a report on a legislative proposal, and you know, I mean, the interests are channeled through the members of the European Parliament or the national governments, because they can actually make amendments to the text. So why would you go? Why would, you know, look at any lobbyist? Why would you go lobby the Committee of the Regions when you just go to the government or to a member of parliament to get your point through? So it's I don't know what it's supposed to do. The functioning of the European Parliament versus national parliaments, quite different, because so far we don't have a clear coalition and opposition, and on every vote shifting majorities, which makes it quite fun to be in the European Parliament. Because if you're in most national parliaments in the opposition and you have a fantastic idea, you have no chance of making that reality, because they're just going to vote it down because it comes from the opposition. Whereas in the European Parliament, if I have a good idea, I get a majority, it becomes law. And that also means that, you know, I mean, I come from the Greens. In the European Parliament, we only have 10%, but we still get to be sort of rapporteurs, the main negotiators on important files, and we get huge things through. So that's quite cool in a way. Obviously, I still want there ultimately to be a coalition and to be a real functioning European government that actually links to a majority in the European Parliament. So it's going to make it less fun for the parliamentarians, but I think overall for European democracy probably, makes it more identifiable for citizens who's at fault when they don't like the kind of policies that come from the Union. That question whether the motion of censure or the right of initiative is more important, I think at the end of the day, both, right? I think we should play our muscle more. I was one of those, I submitted an amendment before the summer, sort of checking how many people in the House would be willing for a motion of censure over von der Leyen's failure to protect the rule of law. We're at 160, or we were at that point at 161 members, so we could have triggered, but we couldn't have won the motion. My feeling was always, it starts really biting once we have about a third of Parliament behind something like that. But I also think that loud reflection on possible motion of censure has, I think it has played a role, for example, in the case that she still hasn't paid out any recovery fund money to Poland. So it does work, right? And finally, am I more representing Europeans or my local constituency? I think you probably get a different answer from different members of Parliament. I see myself as representing European interests. When I discuss, when I make my voting decisions, when I organize my work, I work quite a lot on what I think is one of the biggest threats to the European Union, what's going on in Hungary and in Poland. It also, my local voters also support that, but I'm not sure whether, that's the main issue they currently see in their daily lives in the city of Aachen in Germany. So yeah, it's somewhere in between. I still need to get re-elected. So ultimately that plays a role, but I also think that my voters understand and will re-elect me if I do things that are working for all of Europe, and I don't exclusively focus on getting a few extra EU euros into my constituency. The kind of pork barreling and stuff that you sometimes see in the United States. I think luckily we still reasonably little in EU decision making, and I think it's good and it makes better decisions for Europe as a whole. So I think we're not bad, but the logic is quite different for depending on MEPs, also depending on how the elections work. Again, as a French liberal, you mostly need to make sure that Macron is still on your good side. You have countries where you have open lists, so they need to pay a lot more attention, that they are well known in their constituencies, because voters might just, alter the lists. We in Germany have closed lists. So for me, actually, the party members in a way play a much bigger role in my political future than general voters. We still as Greens need to get enough votes, but my personal role where I end up on the list is decided by party delegates. So I need to spend a little bit of time touring party events so that they have all seen me and hopefully put me on a good spot again.
Thanks so much. Ian, you have a question?
Yes. If I could just say what many people, the question about the Committee of the Regions, if you just complain that they do nothing but just produce reports, well, for decades, that's what people said about the European Parliament, before the European Parliament actually got power. But anyway, I'll leave that aside. Question about what is the position of Britain after Brexit? Basically, I think it's completely unsettled. And this is a problem for Britain. It's also a problem for the European Union. They don't know how to deal with this gigantic country on their periphery. They're used to dealing with very small countries on the periphery, and like the EFTA countries, and those countries have have basically found a modus vivendi with the EU and the EU together, because they accept the EU's rules without having any say over the making of those rules. So they're rule takers without being rule makers, and because they're so small, it's from a democratic point of view, it's problematic, but it's tolerable. But then now you've got this gigantic country, well, very large country, former member state, sitting on the edge of Europe, and it's unclear what their relationship is going to be with the EU, and even 6 years after, it's been 6 years since the Brexit vote. It's been 2.5 years since the UK actually left the EU, but still, it's completely unclear what is going to be the future relationship between the EU and the UK. And they're still talking about like a bonfire of EU rules, because when the UK left the EU, they retained all EU law, and now all these EU laws are still on the books in the UK, and the question and because of the domestic politics in the EU, and you had this conservative this race for the conservative leadership, the two competitors were competing with each other how anti-EU they could be, and they were talking about literally throwing out, getting rid of every single EU regulation that was on the books in the UK by the end of 2023. Which is crazy, but that's it's something that sounds good if you are trying to win the votes of the 160,000 people who vote who are the members of the Conservative Party in Britain who vote in leadership elections. I would. There was recently a poll. Well, I mean, yesterday there was a poll that showed Labour ahead by 33 points, 54 to 21. That Labour with a likely vote of 54%, Conservatives likely vote of 21%. And there's also been polls showing that there's a persistent majority in favor of rejoining the European Union, something around 54%. But there's within British politics, there's no permission structure. There's no procedural channel that would get Britain to rejoin the European Union, because it's not in Labour's interest certainly the Conservatives are well against it. It's not in Labour's interest to promote it. And if there was some kind of a way to have cross-party agreements to get there, then that would be, because then there's a majority, not only a majority in the country, but a majority amongst people in the parliament, and majority if you look at the different parties. But there's no way for them, because of the first past the post system, there's no way for them to kind of get together and actually promote that. I would say that as a closing point, that if you are a rejoiner, time is not on your side, because if you look at history, and there's no historical case of a member state that's left the European Union, but there are states that have come close to joining but didn't join, like Norway, Iceland, Switzerland, and in all of those cases, the vote was very, very close at the time, but then over time, public opinion sort of settled on the fact of being outside, being on the periphery outside the European Union. So in those countries, there's no, like the support for actually joining the European Union is actually well below like 50%. So if history is any guide, then Britain will likely fall into that kind of pattern of being sort of comfortable with being on the outside over time. And so I would say that if you're a joiner, then now is a time to make the case for rejoining the European Union.
Thank you. Natalie?
I don't have much to add. So on the feeling of representation by members of parliament, I think Daniel summarized it very well. So it's a personal issue, I think, for all MEPs. Each MEP will answer differently about who they feel they represent first. And they have like multiple factors influencing how they feel about it, their view of Europe, because for a Green, it will be much different from what an MEP from radical right, for instance, will feel they represent. They usually don't feel they represent Europeans, which makes sense according to their view of Europe and their ideology. The electoral system plays a key role. And the main principle, as we say in academic for MEPs, is the national party still. So you have to be re-elected, and national parties, usually they don't grant much importance to what you did in European Parliament, which is a shame, but they usually look at a lot of stuff before putting a member on their list. And then there is not much possibility of pork barrel politics because the EU doesn't have much redistributive options. And on the confidence of the vote of confidence for the Commission, of course, the EU remains a very hybrid system through time. So at the beginning, it was perceived as, the Commission should be independent. It evolved. We know now that the initiative from the Commission, a very small minority, comes from inside the Commission and comes from all kinds of angles. And some people are pushing for a fully parliamentarized EU, but then it will have consequences on the parliament, on what kind of privileges you have there, on what an MP can do, because indeed now an MEP is more free than in national parliaments, especially if you belong to a smaller group and not a majority. So you have shifting coalitions at the moment, but if you need a stable bloc to support a government, the Commission, then MEPs from smaller parties will have much less leeway to have their view represented in the end. So I'm still unconvinced that it's very desirable in all its aspects. So I don't have a firm opinion on that. It's true that now you have downsides, but a fully parliamentarized system in the EU, I'm not sure that everybody gets when they push for it about the negative sides as well, especially for the European Parliament.
One sentence though, because you asked whether it's more the nationality or the party that plays a role in voting decisions. I'm not sure of the statistical analysis, but I would say parliamentary group way stronger than nationality. I'm not sure I'm aware of even a single vote where we had where all the Germans vote together. I almost never vote on the same line as the AfD, ID members. And you see it with them that, they believe so much in national and, only doing that, yet they get sucked into that logic as well, where they have to organize in a political group and then they defend things in a political group where you would sort of question whether they by themselves sitting in Germany would really have come up with, for example, liking Viktor Orban and sending lots of money German taxpayer money into a corrupt system. Yet they, since they kind of want him in their political group or some of their friends are, so that logic much stronger.
Thanks so much for this reflection. Alvaro, would you like to comment? Okay, then we have more questions from the audience and we will collect again for a second round. So we have again the queue. And I will bring that. You had a question I saw in the first.
Hello, I'm Nick. I'm from the Research Master European Studies, also from Maastricht University. And my question would be first on COSAC. You mentioned COSAC. I would really like to get to know like who is represented there. Are it primarily the lower houses or the senates in the national member states? And are certain member states more or less represented there? And secondly, I think you mentioned the orange card procedure in the early warning system. Could you maybe all give your opinion a little bit on what you think of it and what might be the future for the early warning system?
We still debate that in academia. So who else would like to handle this?
Yeah, I have a follow-up question for Daniel. So you say that your work in European Parliament is driven by European interests, and you work on the rule of law in Poland and Hungary, not necessarily topics that are very relevant for the everyday lives of people in Aachen, right? And then you also say that your accountability is within the Green Party, among members of the Green Party. So how do you perceive, to whom are you politically accountable then, and how do you perceive your political accountability then? How heavy does it weigh on your mandate? And what is your, how do you see your role as a European parliamentarian in convincing people that are, not engaged in politics, not engaged in the Green Party, and not even engaged like in European politics? How do you do that as a European Parliament? Is it something that is important to you in your everyday work as a politician?
Okay, very simple question. Thank you so much.
So thank you for answering this question. And I think working like in the European Parliament is like that. It's like working like in a real parliament, because if you work like in national parliaments and you are like on the opposition group, it's like you can do nothing, just like make the bills and try to make them pass, or it will be like just elaborate the bills for getting like into a press news, so that's really cool. And another question, I saw that yesterday, the opposition leader, the Mexican opposition leader, he came to the European Parliament like to suggest like a recommendation for the European Parliament to the government of Mexico, like to improve like or to respect human rights. I really want to know if like this is possible. Like, I mean, I know you made recommendations, but what's like the relation with like Mexico and the European Parliament? This is like something that will happens really often. They also come like to the European Human Rights Commission. I know it's nothing related with the European Union, but I mean, it's just weird for me. So yeah.
Anyone else? Okay, then we give the panelists an opportunity to wrap this up. And you've got many questions, and we start again. Or do you want to start? Okay, let's mix it up. Natalie, go.
Yeah, I don't have anything more to say. I just wanted to ask one question to Daniel and one question to Jan. So the first one is for Jan. In my understanding, the House of Commons and the House of Lords before Brexit were very much involved in issues like the rights of national parliaments in the EU. And they were behind this idea of a red card, of green card. And now that the UK is out, what are your expectations on those ideas about an increased role for national parliaments without the UK pushing for it? And then one for Daniel. On Monday, I discussed with my students about the fact that in academia, we tend to focus on either pro-EU or anti-EU citizens or politicians and so on. But if we look at polls, the main group and the biggest change after Maastricht was the fact that most people, they still don't care or are indifferent or ambivalent to the EU. And so how can we, how do you tackle that issue, whether in Germany or in Europe in general, about all those people that could flip on to one side or another, and that in their daily life, they don't see Europe and what it brings. Thank you.
I don't know if you have another reflection or question. No. Do we? I actually have questions, and we are very undemocratic right now. We're here in a room, and we haven't listened to anyone on the screen. So are there any questions? And I don't know logistically how we do this, but do we have any questions from the screen? No? Okay, that's good. So then, Ian, you got some questions about the UK and other things, early warning, that's your research also?
Yes.
And COSAC.
So the question about COSAC, excellent question. I mean, the short answer is that national parliaments are represented, both the lower and the upper houses are represented in COSAC. And COSAC is an interesting institution in that you have you can send 6 members of parliament to either from either the upper or the lower house to the meeting, and to the chagrin of the European Parliament is represented on a level of equality. The European Parliament can only send 6 MEPs to a COSAC meeting, and which is unlike the CFSP meeting where the European Parliament can send more. I think it's 16. So in interparliamentary relations, there's often a kind of a fight between the national parliaments and the European Parliament. The European Parliament wants to be wants to have special treatment in interparliamentary forums. They want to be overrepresented. And
you represent a few more people than the Luxembourg City Council.
Fair enough. And so that's kind of an ongoing debate within interparliamentary forums. And I could talk more and more about that, but I'll leave it aside for now. The early warning mechanism as people will probably know, and this is, I've done a fair amount of research on the early warning mechanism. What has been its overall impact? It was introduced in the Lisbon Treaty in 2009, and so it's been in place for more than 12 years. Well, there have been 3 yellow cards, right? So that's a case where 1/3 of national parliaments raise objections to a European legislative proposal. And of those 3, what happened to those 3 proposals? One of them was withdrawn by the Commission, the Monti II proposal about the right to strike, but the other 2 actually went ahead and kind of passed into law. The EPPO, that passed into law and it was created, the European Public Prosecutor's Office. And then the third one is about, again, about the posted workers, and that passed into law as well. So it's not a great, that's not a great advertisement for the power of national parliaments. If you've had over 12 years, they've actually forced the withdrawal of 1 legislative measure, which was unpopular anyway. In a bit of research that I did recently, I tried to look at other proposals that got half the number of votes needed for a yellow card. So there's proposals like about women on boards. So I can't remember the proper term for it, gender on in corporate governance. And there were a number of others like, and basically I was looking at whether or not national parliaments raised objections, and whether or not the objections of national parliaments actually had an effect on the final outcome. And my argument was that in some cases they did. So even though, like, there's only, if you're looking for that, like the smoking gun is that one case, Monti II, where the proposal was actually withdrawn. But if you look at the substance of the proposals that actually ended up getting passed into law, in some cases, you could say that the final legislation did in some ways reflect the concerns raised by national parliaments. And the European Public Prosecutor's Office is an example of that. The final result was different from the original proposal. And Natalie's question about the House of Commons and the House of Lords, whether or not, and you're right, they were that the British parliamentarians were some of the most vocal and active in trying to promote the role of national parliaments in the European Union. And in fact, this is kind of a historical footnote now, but we would have had a red card if the British people had voted to remain in the European Union. And part of the deal, part of David Cameron's deal with the European Union would involve a red card which would have given national parliaments a bit more say in the European legislative process. But of course, they voted to leave, and so that was a dead letter. And whether or not, and basically the answer to your question is I don't know whether it would have made a difference, whether it makes a big difference having having Britain outside of the European Union from the point of view of national parliament.
So I'm going to start with how does my accountability work? I mean, I react to arguments. You know, if I do something and someone convinces me that the position I hold or what I'm doing or that I'm focusing on the wrong problem, I think about it. Sometimes I'm convinced, sometimes I'm not convinced. Ultimately, sort of the hard accountability, as I said, for me is, well, one, German voters and how many votes they give to the Greens. And as I said, more importantly, the party delegates that decide where I go on the list, and that determines whether I'm part of those that are elected or that are just on the list and are not elected. That's the hardcore of it. But you know, I'm susceptible. You ask me questions, you send me emails, you write hateful comments under my social media posts. It might change something. You know, the more hate, probably the less it's going to change something. But, you know, I mean, still, you know, I take it up. I write an op-ed in the newspaper, and, you know, I look at the comments that gets online, and then I reflect on, is what I'm saying, you know, what kind of reaction does that produce? Do I remain convinced of what I said, sort of thing. The functioning of parliamentarians, there's one thing that I would say, yes, it's cool to be an MEP and you can do lots of things. There is certain political groups in the parliament that take this more seriously than others. And I would generally, you know, I mean, obviously as a Green, I would say that we take this very seriously, you know, and our Green members spend lots of time on those amendments and then fighting for them to be adopted. And there's other members of parliament, I would say, particularly on the extreme right, that interpret their role more as, you know, you never see them in trialogues or in shadow meetings negotiating amendments. They use the parliament more as a background for their YouTube videos. You know, they hold their plenary speeches not to convince their colleagues sitting in the plenary, but to get lots of clicks online. It's a different interpretation, and there's no judgment here what is better, because, you know, using the European Parliament as a background for your YouTube videos seems to be getting, you know, they get more votes than we do. So, you know, from an electoral point of view, if that is what voters want to see, you know, not the actual legislative outcome, but, you know, someone that has a nice opinion in their view, it's a valid strategy that a sizable chunk of voters seem to be okay with. Found the question quite interesting. Why does the European Parliament do foreign policy when we have no say on it? sometimes ask myself that question as well. We do all these emergency resolutions on Thursdays when we are in Strasbourg. Often sort of most of the MEPs have left, and those that work on foreign policy have to stay the Thursday afternoon to do those. They do have an impact. You know, there's lots of countries where a positioning by the European Parliament, you know, it counts for something. And obviously the European Commission sometimes reads what we do, it makes it in the media, it shapes public debate, and thereby has an impact. Obviously, would I want the European Parliament to have a bigger say on foreign policy? Yeah. And probably if you want to make that claim, you know, start delivering on actually doing it is probably a good strategy. On all those countries that you mentioned that are sort of not at the voting table, but on the periphery, like Switzerland and Norway and the UK now. I think particularly the case of Switzerland always puzzles me. Since I work a lot with democracy organizations, and they always think of Switzerland as the pinnacle of democracies, right? Direct democracy, and it works so well. And yet, much of the laws that apply to Swiss companies, to Swiss citizens, you know, they receive by fax from Brussels, and they have no say. They have no members in the European Parliament, they have no commissioners, they have no government representatives in the council. So they're basically, I mean, at best, they function a bit like a lobby group. You know, they get to say, we like this law or that law better, but they don't have a vote. I find that highly undemocratic. I was actually on the fence on the Brexit vote, whether I should vote against the Brexit deal, because basically allowing the Brits voluntarily to give up the democratic say on EU rules that are still going to apply to them, you know, it's that question, do you allow democracy to abolish itself by a vote kind of question. And actually in the German constitution, we do not allow it. You know, democracy in Germany is not legally allowed to abolish itself. And I think there's some, you know, some truth to that idea. I did vote for the Brexit agreement in the end because the chaos would have been so substantial. But yeah, I still think it's a bad idea for all those countries to have voted not to have a seat at the table. And some of these, you know, they even pay the membership fee and they still, you know, prefer not to have a vote. And then there's all these like ludicrous arrangements like that. Denmark opted out of the interior Schengen information system and stuff, and then they pay for people in the commission that actually sit in front of a computer with the Schengen information system, but instead of accessing it at a computer themselves in Denmark, they prefer to call someone in Brussels that sits. I mean, you couldn't come up with such lunacy, but that's, you know, when people vote, no, we're not going to be part of that, but then de facto they need to be part of that, it gets you those kind of solutions. Last point on Natalie's question, you know, the undecideds and the pro-EU, counter-EU. I mean, I find the polls are reasonably clear in most EU member states whether people support the union or not. I think Brexit has reminded lots of people of what we actually have, you know, where you might think, well, is it really that good to be in the EU? And then people realize, oh yeah, actually, yeah, it's probably pretty good to be part of that. And while we all have to fight for people to understand, you know, first of all, how many advantages we have from this, but then also, you know, I find the debate often still too much. Are you pro-EU or against EU? The question should really be, do you like the current political majorities in the EU? Because the EU can be lots of things, you know, we can change it completely if you change the people that have power in Europe. And, you know, if you didn't like austerity, well, austerity was because we had a conservative majority, both in the council and in the commission and in the parliament. So change that instead of abolishing the EU, I would say. And interestingly, I would still say that, you know, at least the against EU debate in terms of leaving the euro or the European Union in a way is gone since Brexit. You know, when there were all the Geert Wilders and Marine Le Pen and others saying, we're next, you know, they're all not saying that anymore. Look how, you know, I still don't agree with what Meloni wants to do, but look how different her proposals on Europe are these days than what we still had a couple of years ago from the extreme right in Europe. So, I mean, that still doesn't mean that things are good, and they're blocking a lot of things, and particularly the positive reforms are still very difficult, if not impossible, to achieve with those kind of people in national governments. But I think at least the debate about countries leaving is gone, and I hope gone for good.
Thanks so much. I would now like to wrap up this panel. Thank you so much for the panelists. We will continue the discussion, and we will have now continuing the discussion. You all have a label, group 1, group 2. We will still have a break of about 10 minutes. So I would like us to come back, let us say at 12:10. The group 1 stays here. Group 2 goes upstairs. We have some questions to discuss. We might not get through all the questions. It's very important that we have lunch. So at 12:30, we will have lunch. Very much thanks to Daniel Freud, who has to leave us. He has work to do. It was great to discuss with you, and yeah, see you soon. We have, of course, shrunk since the lunch break, but let us focus on our attention on the second panel. We're still missing a speaker, but we will still go ahead and hope that she turns up in a moment. So what are we going to do in this panel? I already said in the morning, we're going to look at parliaments, and on the other hand, we're going to look at the Conference on the Future of Europe, and more in general also citizen involvement, because that is, of course, at the heart of the Conference of the Future of Europe are the citizen panels. And that's one way of bringing citizens closer to the European Union. And that's, of course, also one thing that we're trying to do here today. And speaking on the Conference of Future of Europe, we have Gaetan arriving. We're all very busy, so we very much understand that work also has to be done. Why? And not everyone can always be in an academic conference. So just take your seat and your time, Gaetan. So we are now going to discuss the Conference on the Future of Europe, but also other ways of involving citizens in EU decision-making more in general. And so we have a similar setup as from the former first panel in the morning, which everybody agrees was really nice. So what we've done, we've given the speakers some questions, and they are free to choose whatever they want to focus on. So I'm also not really reading out the questions, but then we come back to these questions, and then we also open, of course, the floor for you to come in as an audience. So, and then we also have a discussant who will pick up on some of the things that have been said, but also should feel free to bring in his own experiences and his own views. And I would like to change the order of the panelists, and I will give Corina Stratulat first the floor because she has been sitting here. No, you can just start. That's fine, right? If you want, or Gaetan, if you want to start. I just want to introduce yourself. Yes. So Corina Stratulat is a senior policy analyst and head of the European Politics and Institution Program, the European Policy Center. And next to her, and you can still figure out who wants to go first, next to her is Gaetan Ricard-Nihul, who is a former member of the Common Secretariat for the Conference on the Future of Europe. And many of you know her, and because you have worked on the Conference of the Future of Europe, where she was very much involved. And next to her is Flavia Sandu, a member of the executive board of the Young European Federalists Europe. And then we have our discussant, welcome, from the cabinet of the European Ombudsman, Markus Spörer. So we have different views. So who would like to go first? I don't want to impose anything on anyone. Yeah, okay, just kick it off.
Yeah, hello. You can hear me, right? My voice is anyway a bit loud, so I don't know if the microphone is needed. Right. Well, I was going to focus a little bit more on the recommendations and the outcomes. So assuming that maybe Gaetan will want to give us her insights of the process, but we'll see how we play this out. Before I start, maybe it's worthwhile asking whether you are familiar at all with the Conference on the Future of Europe. Yeah, I mean, some of you probably were involved in the organization of some of the panels, because one of them took place in, at least one of them, I think, in Maastricht. Yeah. But the rest, have you heard about the Conference on the Future of Europe? Not really.
Kind of.
Kind of. Okay. So maybe it will be useful if Gaetan refers more specifically to some of the elements in the process. What I can do is to distinguish a little bit between two dimensions of this initiative that has taken place. Two dimensions which I will keep distinct just for the sake of the conversation we're having, but in reality they are of course interrelated. And one of them refers to the process of the conference, and the other one to its recommendations or the outcome of the exercise. On the process side, what should be said, and then maybe we can go into details later on, is that the conference has experimented with a number of deliberative and participatory elements on an unprecedented scale. And this has happened, for example, in the context of the European Citizens Panels that some of you are familiar with. It has happened also in the conference plenary, where sort of the representative and the participatory dimensions of the conference have come together. It has happened thanks to the multilingual platform where citizens from across Europe could go and express their opinions or their positions on the different topics discussed by the conference. And so there were all these very different elements that were put in place to enable citizens from across member states at a different level of governance to give their opinions about the future of Europe on specific themes that had been chosen for the conference. And so now we can discuss about each of these different elements later on, but suffices to say for now that by and large, it actually, they were more successful than expected. So it kind of worked. Everything went rather smoothly. Of course, there were some issues, some problems that were encountered. Some of them had to do, for example, with the broadness of the themes chosen. The topics for discussions were very large. Others had to do with the fact that the time for discussion was rather limited, and many decisions were taken in the end over a short period of time. Just as a parenthesis here, initially the conference had been envisioned as a 2-year process, and it ended up being just taking place over just 1 year. So obviously things get more condensed time-wise. So there was lack of time. There were also quite weak links between the different levels at which this conference was taking place. So although in principle, some connections had been envisioned between events taking place in the member states and the European Citizens Panels or the multilingual digital platform, in reality, those links didn't prove very solid or as solid as one might wish. And there was also some ambiguity of purpose. What were we really going to do with the citizens' input? Is this going to be just an exercise of raising awareness about European affairs, or is it really an exercise through which we're going to listen to the people and then act on what they have told us. So there was some ambiguity of purpose there as well. But all of these, let's say, problems that one can mention regarding the process ultimately were givens from the start. And so organizers basically had to work with these challenges or had to work around them. And these obstacles encountered had also had therefore more to do with differences in interest and in opinions between and within different EU institutions, or between and within different tiers of governments and stakeholders, more so than with the methodological design that was chosen. And in turn, I would say also that these problems were also an expression of the little or no awareness with participatory exercises, especially on a grand scale, which tends to breed hesitation, especially on the side of political actors involved. Now, of course, an inclusive, participatory European Union is not something that will come about overnight or thanks to the conference alone. So it's not like this was really the expectation, or this is what we're discussing here. If this were to happen, it will require continued reflection on how institutions can support bottom-up efforts with the appropriate tools, with the appropriate funding, with constructive engagement. It will also demand persevering in the courage to actually involve citizens and use deliberative processes for the purpose of decision-making. And so, interestingly enough, this is something that citizens crave for. And we have seen that out of the European citizens panels have come calls for more frequent online and offline interactions between the EU, between citizens and the EU level, or for holding regular citizens' assemblies. And the same can be said about the multilingual digital platform, where citizens expressed a similar desire for them to continue to be involved and consulted on European affairs in the future through new mechanisms. And what we're seeing now is also that these calls have actually not gone on a deaf ear. In its first report, first analysis of proposals made after the conference and the communication on its follow-up for the conference, which I think came out in June, the European Commission actually spoke of its plans to hold citizens' panels ahead of certain key legislative proposals. And this intention was reiterated then more recently by the Commission President Ursula von der Leyen in her latest speech, State of the Union address, where she committed to making citizens' panels a regular feature of the Union's democratic life. Of course, this doesn't mean that a conference 2.0 will now take place. What it means is that, we're now going to look at the lessons learned from the conference exercise, and then we're going to build on the best practices and create new and effective ways to engage citizens more systematically in European politics. And to this end, I would say that it is also important to look also beyond the conference, to look at all the deliberative initiatives that take place on a regular basis at the national, regional, and local level throughout the EU, because these exercises systematically consult or involve citizens in decisions about real-life issues, for example, about how to spend the city's budget, or how to tackle online hate and harassment, or how to improve the quality of air, or whether to legalize same-sex marriages. So, and in doing so, these kind of exercises that happen within the national arena or at the regional level, they provide abundant expertise and lessons that now we can use to improve mechanism also at EU level. But then what is important to emphasize here is that perfecting deliberative processes ultimately is not enough and will never be enough. And this brings me to the second dimension of the conference, which leads to the outcome. it is equally important that these processes, these deliberative processes, at the end of the day also count in policymaking. So this means that the more citizens-friendly European democratic system will also have to listen and act on what citizens express through these processes. To put it in simple words, they will have the feedback loop with the citizens will have to be closed. And it's true that maybe to do so, we will need to revisit certain existing decision-making procedures, or we will need to institutionalize channels for European citizens to actually be able to influence policy outcomes, which also means that it's a step between a deliberative process and a policy or a political decision. We still need to take that step. And to do that, perhaps, this will happen through a gradual cultural change and also through a wide recognition that in the end, citizens can add value to the decision-making process. So the conference is a stepping stone in that respect, but it's not really the end of the road, and the road ahead remains arguably still long. Of course, the outcome of the conference does not only include the recommendations linked to participatory democracy, it is also a vast compendium of policy proposals. And so the institutions and member states now have to respond to this, not only for the sake of providing a response to citizens, and therefore making sure that the conference exercise is truly participatory, but also because in doing so, in responding to these recommendations that have come out of the conference, it will help to give direction to the European project in a geopolitical context that has been transformed by the war, by Russia's war in Ukraine. The multiple consequences of the new era that we live in have actually increased the urgency of policy reforms, as well as institutional innovations in order to put the EU in a better place to deal with the new reality and also with future challenges, including by following some of the lines proposed in the conference outcome. Of course, in the short time, the EU's reactions to the war are, oftentimes they have to be quick in response to events that are unfolding. So there is a certain short-termism that it's involved in the way that the EU responds because of what is happening at the moment. However, it is also crucial that the EU thinks a bit long-term and in responding to today's transformative times, and actually shows a little bit of political readiness and determination to undertake substantial reforms of EU policies, but also governance. Even before Russia invaded Ukraine, we saw that the Union had been struggling with all sorts of multiple interrelated complex crises over the past decade. And every time a crisis came up, the Union or the impression is that the Union tried its best to avoid that the situation gets out of control, but it never really went to the bottom to the root problem, to make the far-reaching structural changes that were necessary to deal with the underlying causes of the polycrisis, but also with the multiple consequences of the polycrisis. And so hopefully now it will get inspired by the conference outcome, but it will also use the opportunity of this momentum or motivation that the new context is providing in order to identify and to go for more durable solutions and increase the capabilities of the European Union to react to fundamental challenges more effectively. Very, very shortly, and with this I will finish, I wanted to say that if we look now at how the member states or how the Union and the member states have reacted to the outcome of the conference, which calls actually in parts for quite fundamental EU reform, including potential treaty change, we see that, well, it's not awfully encouraging, because on the one hand, we see that the European Parliament and the European Commission seem to already be on board with the idea of maybe engaging with and having a convention, a European convention take place, but some of the member states still remain hesitant, less so within the core countries, EU member states, which exhibit a certain degree of openness to the idea of treaty changes that have been jointly decided, but more on other countries who are still of the opinion that a lot can still be done within the existing treaty framework, and we shouldn't just jump on the treaty change train too quickly, too prematurely. Now, it's true that many objectives can be accomplished based on the existing EU treaties, and but it's also true that some of the innovations will also require amending the Union's primary law in order to be able to have the Union in a position to react to challenges more efficiently. And here I want to just mention that there is a recent technical assessment that was carried out by the Council Secretariat General, and in there one can see that they identified that actually within the package of 300 proposals from citizens, only 18 would actually require treaty change. I don't want to, I can send you the link to the document and you can consult it carefully, just to give you some examples of the areas that might require treaty change. This include, for example, so if the EU were to listen to citizens and enable the EU, for instance, to require certain issues to become a mandatory part of the educational curriculum across member states. This is a kind of topic that, or recommendation that would probably require treaty change. Or if the EU, if we were to provide the EU with shared competencies in health, or if we were to shift from unanimity to qualified majority in the European Council, including for situations where the passerelle clause does not work, for example, on decisions that have military implications or on defense matters, or if we were to change the names of the institutions, because citizens had actually asked for the institutions to be renamed because they found it very confusing, they couldn't tell the difference among them, or if we were to give the European Parliament the right to call for EU-wide referendums, or if we were to give the EP, the national parliaments and regional parliaments the right to the right of initiative, and so on and so forth. So there are a number, 18, according to the Secretary General in the Council, 18 of these proposals would certainly require treaty change. But the message that I want to leave you with, and this is really the final word from me, is that enacting policy reforms, or how can I say, enacting indispensable policy reforms given our times, and treaty change should not be seen as an either or kind of option. The two should be pursued in parallel. There's scope to argue that they could even reinforce each other. The European Commission seems to be of a similar opinion, and so a comprehensive conference follow-up would probably have to follow both tracks. Policy reform, but also wherever necessary, treaty change. Up here, I know I went a little bit over line, but I had to improvise. Do you want me to pass the floor?
Okay, done, I think. Yeah. Thanks so much.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm very sorry for my late arrival. I think Karina has already explained very well a lot of elements I wanted to share with you, but perhaps indeed, if you, not all of you are familiar with the Conference on the Future of Europe, might be worthwhile to recall what it was. I think it was indeed, I think the word was used by Corina, an unprecedented experiment in participatory and deliberative democracy at EU level. If you look at the joint declaration that was adopted, and this is really the founding document. It's very striking how much it is a citizen-centered process. It's thought like that, and the whole build-up of the different elements of the conference were really always referring that we are doing something to listen to citizens, to give them a chance to shape the future of the EU. So everything has to be thought as putting the citizen at the center of the process. It was also unprecedented because it was the first time that we were doing that, the three institutions together, which meant indeed building up a common secretariat, to which I participated. And of course, a more complicated governance, probably with an executive board, with different political representative, etc., but also very meaningful for the citizens who, if you ask them their view on the future of the EU, they would want to speak to the three institutions that have in their hands this future and are the main actors of the legislative process. And third, I think what was really striking in the conference is that it was quite bold in a way, because it really tried to test new democratic tools and didn't shy away from democratic innovation. And this was true, I think, for the three pillars of the conference that Corinna mentioned. First, this multilingual digital platform, which of course could have been more citizen-friendly. I mean, there are many things that you could improve on that side, but was the first time that we actually integrated in the Europa environment, the website environment of the Commission, a deliberative instrument, a multilingual deliberative instrument, so people could comment on people's ideas and could dialogue, exchange between each other, all the citizens, with the automatic translation that you could use. And this was also the hub where all the decentralized events happening in the member states in the conference were reported, and this is where also they share the ideas coming out of this event. So that was the first pillar. The second were the European Citizens Panels. On that, also very unprecedented, at least to that scale. We didn't have any big experience of citizens' assemblies randomly selected. The Citizen Assembly now have been used for decades at local level, increasingly so at regional level. At pan-European level, it was very relatively new. Randomly selected panels that we constitute as representative as possible of the EU geographical and sociological diversity. So we had 4 groups of 200 citizens who deliberated together in a multilingual environment, again, 24 languages, for 3 weekends. So that was the second pillar. And the third, I think, is something that is actually totally unprecedented, I think, and very innovative. This was another deliberating body, if you want, that came after all this process of generating ideas through the platform or through the panels. And it was indeed, as Corinna said, mixing political representatives with citizens coming from the European panels, but also national panels and events, and organized civil society, local authorities. So in total, about 450 people who again met for several weekends and transform, in fact, the ideas, the recommendations that came out from the panels, and also use what was on the platform. They transformed it into proposals, and indeed you referred to 300. Corinna, in fact, there are 49 proposals and about 300 measures. But indeed, so if you want, what is really unprecedented here is that very often when you have a participatory process, it creates recommendations that go directly into the representative bodies and the decision-making process with more or less success. Here you had a kind of intermediary step with this body, the plenary, that transformed the recommendation that already created a space for exchange between this deliberative and participatory process and the representative work. And so the dialogue produced proposals which I think have probably be already more buy-in by the political actors than usually this kind of recommendations may have. So this was for the process. I can answer those questions if you have later on, but maybe let me concentrate a little bit on the follow-up as well, because I completely agree with Corina that without follow-up, it's not worthwhile doing these kind of things. You know, it was very clear in the joint declaration that I was mentioning earlier that the three institutions committed to follow-up and committed to feedback. The two words are quite important actually, because I've known also a lot of participatory processes where some follow-up was happening, but nobody heard about it. So everyone thought, well, you know, this is in the bin. So it's follow-up and feedback on the follow-up. We still need to know about it. So on the follow-up, indeed, there is the two types, at least. One is concerned the policy proposals that were made, and indeed on that, I think the communication of the Commission in June was very clear already to the things that were already on in the pipeline, but would be accelerated because of the citizens' proposals, the things that were not yet in the pipeline, but the Commission was ready to put on the table, and the things that the Commission was always also ready to consider. And in these three categories will continue to be followed up on the Commission side. And if you look at the State of the Union speech of the President von der Leyen that she did recently, you will see that in the legislative proposals that accompany the speech, you will see an asterisk next to a lot of them, and this is because they are linked to the conference. So for me, to be very transparent with you, I'm actually very pleasantly surprised by the way the commissions are taking this, the three institutions are taking this process seriously. I mean, the mere fact that the Council has taken the time to look at every single measure and to say which one would require what, I mean, it's something that we've never seen before. So for me, it's a very important qualitative step that we are making here. Second area of follow-up, which is also extremely important, but is also based on the proposals, because indeed the citizens ask for more citizen engagement of this type. So on that front, I must say that at the moment, each institution is looking at what to do in their own sphere. Maybe there will be at some stage another big interinstitution in the board, but at the moment, each institution is looking in their own sphere what they can do. And the Commission has committed to a new phase of citizen engagement, which I think is extremely important and exciting. First, indeed, the President von der Leyen has clearly said that she wanted the European Citizens Panels to become a regular feature of policy making. For the Commission, it means, because it has the monopoly of initiative, that we will organize 2 or 3 citizen panels per year on some of the legislative proposals. So before the proposal is made, take into account the view from the citizens panel. It also means for the Commission, and this is quite important, that we will also review the way we do citizen engagement online. I mean, the space that you can find for citizen engagement online by trying to rationalize everything that exists. So, for example, there is already public consultations online. There's already the European Citizen Initiative. So we'll put that together, and we will add to that the space that the conference has invented, created, which is a more deliberative, multilingual space for other kind of processes or related processes. Because the idea is, of course, to make sense of all. So a one-stop shop, if you want, online for citizens who want to take part in different participatory processes. I pass on the work that we want to do to better coordinate the services in the Commission, doing some engagement, having a corporate guidebook on best practice, good formats, etc. It may seem less important, but I think it is very important, because now the different services have a tendency to do each their own way. And it's very important to associate the format of citizen engagement with the what it means in terms of accountability, in terms of feedback, and that when you commit to do a format, it means this. And this is also a very important effort that we are making now in the Commission. And finally, and I will stop there, I mean, one thing that we would all agree here, I think, is that the conference is disappointing in terms of its visibility. some of you have not really heard about it. It's not normal. And we cannot say that we want an inclusive process if not very little amount of people hear about it. So there is something with the civic participation endeavors that mean we need to invest more in communication strategy that goes along with these civic participation processes. And so, of course, this is another area where we really need to invest if we want this to be successful.
Thank you so much. So we've also seen different sides of looking at this, and also very interesting way of thinking about follow-up, and also really trying to make sure that this doesn't just stay within the halls that was debated in, but also really feed into the policy process in the future. You can always look at these things glass half empty, but you can also look at these things glass half full. And I think, that's also the way we would like to have this debate. But I would now like to give the opportunity for Flavia Sando to reflect on this, maybe also from younger people perspective, if you so will, and then we'll pass on to you.
Yes, so can you hear me? Okay, cool. I'm also recovering from a sickness, so sorry if I start coughing at some point. I'll try to do far away from the microphone. So I think a lot of already very important points and perspectives have been brought on already in the speeches, so I'll attempt not to repeat myself. I would say from a younger people perspective, right? Let's try to take it from the start. So the digital platform, which was kind of like the first thing that launched, if I'm correct, where people could just put ideas on the platform. It was multilingual. You could read the ideas in any language you wanted. You could go and vote or comment on them and be like, I like this, I think this is great, and people were debating in the comments. I think that was a great approach. I think it helped the fact that it was digital, and I'm not an analyst. I don't know how much it has to do with the fact that we were still in a pandemic when it started, and I assume the institutions were more prone to do digital work than they would have been in the pre-COVID days. But the fact that it was digital and multilingual, I believe, helped a lot of people that maybe heard of it, maybe wouldn't have participated in a process like this otherwise. Because if the process is strictly limited to Brussels, Strasbourg, some member states' capitals, then you are automatically excluding a lot of people on that basis. It being digital, I think, really helped being a bit more inclusive in terms of participation of people of all ages, of all social standings, and so on. However, here comes the negative side. And I think it ties into what you were saying about how many people participated. I think to some extent the digital platform was still people from the inside the bubble, the whatever it was like people from NGOs, people who were already familiar with the process, and not entirely obviously, but I would say generally in a good chunk it might have been that, which I think the process of a digital platform should not be to be an echo chamber. It should be to bring more voices in. This is something that can obviously be worked on for future consultations if the Commission really carries through with the idea of having multiple consultations per year. Another thing generally is the promotion of the conference. I already mentioned as well that it could have been better promoted. And in our view, and mine as well personally, I think one downside to the conference itself was how incredibly bureaucratic, even by EU standards, the whole process was. Because if I ask you if you could tell me how the process of the conference worked, would you be able to? Because I wouldn't be able to see it myself perfectly from the top of my head. I think you would be for obvious reasons. But basically the process itself, in Jeff, we had to do the biggest infographic I saw in my life to be able to explain to people what's going on and for them to understand what's going on. And I think that's also an issue when a process is that complicated and people have a very limited understanding of what's going on. They are going to be a lot more reluctant to want to get involved in it in some capacity, because at the end of the day, you are not sure what's going on. Also because of basically the conference was a 1-year process, right?
asking a person, an average person, you know, not someone from the parliament, from the commission, from NGOs, employees who are paid to do their job regarding this thing. You're asking a normal person to take like all this, you know, time out of their life for a year to do something that they might have no clue what it will result in. You do not see how it works and where it would lead. It's a bit of a big commitment for someone who might not have the ability to do so. So that also, like, I think making a consultation process more clear would help. Of course, again, conference, as previously mentioned, has been like something that is firstly done. It's like, you know, I don't expect anything to be perfect on the first try. That's not how the world works, sadly, maybe. But yeah, it's absolutely something that can be improved on. However, one thing that I think it's worth mentioning, and correct me if I'm wrong, I believe the people who are participating in the panels were actually compensated for the time they have their travels and accommodation covered, right? And in case they had to like lose work days or something, they're compensated for it to some extent, something like that. Yeah, yes. So I think that has been a very good initiative on the part of the institutions to make sure that people who participate are people, it doesn't matter like if you are, because from the start, if you are in a, maybe if you're a student, you cannot afford to just, and you also work a part-time job, for example, you can't afford to just take a few days off to jet off to Strasbourg to discuss whatever was being discussed, right? If you are a full working parent, maybe you're a single parent, maybe you cannot afford that, and so on. And I think offering this like coverage of cost and everything, and allowing people from various social backgrounds to participate in the conference and in the plenaries and having their voice heard, I think that has been a good way to kind of like make it a bit less elitist and so on. Brackets, that way interns would be paid. Anyway, yeah. So I think that was a good initiative, for example. In terms of how successful the conference has been, I mean, I can give you a general perspective and a federalist perspective. From the side of the Young European Federalists, basically looking at the list of final recommendations and measures suggested, it was basically like the wish list for Christmas coming through for us. You know, like everything in there was like very similar with our stances on stuff. And I mean, to some extent, I guess it has to do with the fact that we're very involved in the conference and in the discussions, but we're pretty happy with the results. And overall, I would say just generally having this consultation process and having this many citizens giving an opinion on something and having all this discussion together, you know, even looking at it from a personal perspective instead of like a policy perspective, I think, you know, for some people, it might have felt like some version of Erasmus to some extent, participating in these plenaries. And I think that also helps kind of like build on like, you know, common European identity and feeling more European, if you will. Hold on, I had another point. Yes. Results and follow-up. So this is where I might make people angry here. So basically, I find it very interesting that the Council Secretariat did like this thing where, look, we only 18 of these proposals need a treaty change, so don't worry about it. Like, and these 18 of them are among them a common European army, European competence over health, initiative of legislation, the European Parliament. These are big issues. It's not something that you can just scrap under the carpet and be like, it's okay, we can get over this. We did everything else.
I'm not sure what they're saying that. They're just qualifying different proposals. They're not really saying it's easy or it's, you know.
Fair, but that was going to be my next point. At the same time, don't get me wrong, I think that's very useful for someone who is writing a master thesis or a paper about the conference. I hope people are doing that. That would be cool to read. But at the same time, I maybe wish the institutions would use the energy to start working on the actual proposals and implementing them rather than doing service and stuff, to be fair. Because as mentioned, if like the majority of proposals don't actually require treaty change, then until you agree on treaty change, it's of course going to take a while if it even happens. Just get started working on the actual proposals that don't require that, right? Like you have all the tools in your books, get to it already, right? Because if we usually stay in the institutional limbo that you sometimes take to make decisions and, you know,
for something to go from a proposal to an actual implemented law, regulation, or whatever. If we wait at that usual period of time, which is not, it's usually more than a year, then maybe the participants in the conference are not going to feel so good about it. And here is like one point that I want to make. Usually, like again, with the institutions, with NGOs that are familiar with talking with the institutions, we know how the process works. We know it takes time. We know people take a lot to agree. Like it is known, right? But for the average citizens who was in the conference, sure, they understood what the conference was about, and now they want to see the results. And if the results, if they keep on limbo and waiting and waiting and waiting until the results come, then maybe that person feels like, but what did we do this whole thing for if it's nothing is happening, right? Because I don't know, personally, I feel like if you come to a citizen like 3 years after the process was done, like, look, we finally did this thing, that at that point they're going to forget what it was even about, right? And I think this is one thing where the reputation, if you will, of the conference could have to suffer if concrete action, there are a lot of proposals, some of them require pretty change. You don't have to do all of them at once, but if nothing concrete comes out of it, like the near future, I feel like to some extent the participants in the conference might feel like this was just another thing that they're going to put on a wall somewhere and stuff it, and just going to go down in the archives of EU legislation like everything else. And I think that might actually have a negative influence on the popular perception, right? Because again, not a lot of people might have, like the average EU citizen might have not known about the conference on the future of Europe. But these people, like these citizens participating in the conference, maybe they probably told their family, yeah, I'm going to Strasbourg for a weekend to discuss this thing, and they might have told them, yeah, this is what we want to do, and it's like word of mouth kind of promotion where you do not know about it from like the institution itself, but you know it from people who are involved with it. Like me going to my mom and being like, yeah, this is something, we organized this protest this other day, and she's like, I have no clue what that is about, tell me more. Like it could have been a case like that. And if there is like a negative perception from the part of the participants in the conference that nothing is happening, then obviously they are gonna maybe mention it, to their circles, and word is gonna spread that yeah, this was just whatever for show and nothing is happening. I'm not saying that is what's happening, but I think that is a high risk, and I honestly think that popular word of mouth complaints could do more damage in terms of like credibility than scandals, institutional scandals, or something like that. Because it's when it's coming from something's coming from an institution, it feels far removed from you. When it's coming from a friend or a family member or someone you actually have a daily interaction with, it feels a lot more personal. And if this person who was involved in the process says, then you are not gonna start digging about everything that's actually happening on the institutional level. Look about it, you're just gonna take their word for it. Maybe not the best thing to do, but it is what it is. So yeah, I think that was it.
Thank you so much. Getan, would you like to come in here already? Because it was about risk of not following up, and you had just told us that it will be followed up. So I think, and then we have to discuss this.
Yeah, I really have to discuss that. I just want to say that it's true that a treaty change is part of it. It's also important to not evaluate the follow-up of the conference only on the basis of that. I think this is a bit of a tendency, because some also really wanted to go the first step towards the convention, and they had a tendency then to evaluate it only on the basis of that. So what is important, and what Corinna was saying, is that we should not underestimate perhaps the need to have that at some stage for some of the changes, but it's not all of it. And that's just what we were saying. And then the policy proposal, so you should start and work on it. I think we are. And I think this was the whole point of having this list after the SOTEU with the different elements we were already working on, actually. And for example, and the panel we are implementing, the president has announced that the first panel will be on food waste, that there is a food waste proposal being prepared, and that we should organize a panel on that very soon. So, yeah, I mean, it might not be the whole spectrum of the proposal right now, but step by step.
Yes, so thank you so much. Also for, also in the first panel, we had discussion in between the panelists. But now I would like the opportunity for Markus Spörler to come in. And you have also been working very closely with working in the cabinet of the European Ombudsman. The Ombudsman is of course also very active. I follow the work closely of the European Ombudsman, very active in trying to link EU citizens to EU affairs and also interpreting her role, a bit like the European Parliament, in a very proactive way, also beyond the legal letter, in a positive way, obviously, this, to really giving it shape. And you have also been following the conference very closely. So,
Yes, we have at our office, of course, as you said, been following the conference very closely because for two reasons. Because the Ombudsman offers another type of citizen participation. As you said, citizens can turn to us if they have an issue with EU administration. And that is kind of the conference lifted that to a very large scale, where people could actually bring their ideas in changes and not only complain. And on the other hand, we followed the conference closely because we expected a lot of complaints about the conference, because we thought this is a very, very big thing. People maybe about the way the conference goes, and we didn't get a lot of complaints. We didn't open any inquiries on the conference. That probably speaks for the organizers. Well done, Gaetan. So that was somewhat surprising for us. I discussed this before in the lunch break, and it could also another idea why there were so few complaints could also be that there was not much public attention paid to the conference. But so I mean, to be discussed. Probably both. So I mean, citizens are, and that is a decision that the EU made in 1992 when they introduced the EU citizenships. Citizens are at the center of what the EU does. And in 1992, by the way, with the Treaty of Maastricht, also the Ombudsman was introduced. And so we talked about was the conference a success? And I think we all agree that it was, in terms of what came out, in terms of the outcome that is in the final report of the conference. It's a very good indicator of what people want, and probably gave people the feeling that they could participate in the conference. But of course, the big question is now the long-term impact. We discussed that, the follow-up, and yeah, that's I think something very important. How the conference is followed up. The Ombudsman once talked at a conference event, and she said that the conference shouldn't be an exercise in citizen washing. So she referred to the practice of greenwashing, where a company plants a tree in front of its headquarters, but in the back chops down an entire forest to keep the company running. So it's really kind of a facade of citizen participation to look good, but then nothing comes out. That's not what the Ombudsman said, but she warned that if not properly followed up, that would happen. So let's hope it doesn't. And there we came to, we talked about follow up and feedback, very, very important, and that we can also link to a little bit to the demands that were made in the conference, the recommendations. If you look at the part that was on European democracy, there you see that a lot of the things that that people wanted were the EU should explain its work more. The EU should involve citizens more in a way that they actually understand what's going on. And that so not only for the conference that is the case, but for everything that the EU does, and that's something in Brussels we've been saying for a very long time. And we all know that the EU needs to communicate what it does better, and it needs to be transparent about its work. There is nothing worse than having the assumption that the EU works in secrecy, and that's again ties to our work where we do a lot on EU transparency. That indeed is very important, that the EU at every level communicates actively with citizens and is not afraid to take citizens' calls and to take citizens seriously. And that goes for an administrator in the Commission as well as for the Commission as a whole. One point I wanted to make was on the crisis, since we're talking about crisis today. And yes, we talked about that too, about short-term and problem solutions in times of crisis. And indeed, that seems to be an issue, and that could also be an issue with the follow-up of the conference. When you look at this year's State of the Union speech, there was obviously a lot on current crises, and not that much about the follow-up of the conference, even though it was announced before that this would be a central part of the State of the Union speech, the follow-up on the conference. So the question here that I want to ask is, in order to reflect and to make a meaningful change, can that even happen in times of crisis, or does the EU need a break? Next time we have a couple of years without a crisis that's very immediate, can the EU sit and think about these issues that go a little further and go a little beyond, possibly treaty change, for example, that at this very moment we can't really think about treaty change because we have a war at the brink of Europe. And then yeah, so that would be the question on how is treaty change possible? Tying into that, of course, treaty change, we have to take on board the member states, and without the member states, there will be no treaty change. And to have this, but let's say the conference showed that people want a change. So what we need to do, or what needs to happen, in my opinion, is that national politicians take that into their programs, because the conference showed that this is a popular topic, at least for the people that were involved, and that is something that you can really do national politics with as well, and only then you can go towards treaty change, because you have governments that are interested in actually these things. So a lot of thoughts, a few questions. Maybe I'll pass back to you.
Okay, thank you so much. So who would like to come in here? Then we'll open the discussion. Would someone like to, Corina, Getan, still reflect on what was just said?
I mean, if you want to bring in some questions, we
Yeah.
can address them.
Yeah, okay, let's do it like that. We're also always a very dynamic panel, so we take into account what people want to do. So let's open the floor for discussion. I see Ian. Anyone else? Raise your hand slowly. So Ian Cooper, we will collect questions. Ian, go ahead. And here's the cue.
Sure. I've actually got quite a long question. I've got a long question, so brace yourselves. I'll preface my question by mentioning that I interviewed a member of the Irish Parliament who took part in the plenary, and he was very positive about the experience as a whole, but he made a couple of criticisms. One was that the citizens' recommendations kind of just got waved through. They didn't really get debated in the plenary. But his other comment, which is slightly contradictory, was that that the plenary debate, his observation was that the MEPs in Strasbourg, they just kind of basically carried on the same debate they would normally have with each other in Strasbourg and ignoring the citizens. So that's the preface to my question. And so, which brings me to the main question, which is, do you think that this conference was fundamentally an exercise in deliberative democracy or in participatory democracy? Because it seems to me that it's a little bit of a hybrid, and maybe those two things kind of work at cross purposes. And if I can just make a brief comparison to what the system as it works in Ireland with Citizens' Assembly. So in Ireland, in the last 2 years, they had Citizens' Assemblies on the question of abortion, on the question of marriage equality. And the Citizens' Assembly, they came forward. It was just citizens, I think 100 citizens from across Ireland, representative of across all different kind of cohorts in population, and they recommended liberalizing the abortion law, legalizing same-sex marriage, and their job ended. Right? They made their recommendations, and then the political process carried on. It was passed through Parliament and then eventually through a referendum. So you had this division of labor between the the citizens panel was purely deliberative, but with a purpose and with a very specific single question they were addressing, and then they passed that along through the process, and then eventually in both cases it was a successful change in the Irish Constitution. But my sense is that in the case of the Conference on the Future of Europe, you have a little bit of a hybrid. You've got the citizens panels, but then the citizens also come to take part in the plenary, and it's the question of like citizen washing. It's not entirely clear what the citizens were doing there in the plenary, since they'd already made their recommendations. So I guess, and this is a live issue because we're talking about this as a model for future kind of debate about how to change EU legislation and possibly changing the treaties. So do you think that you think it was an exercise in deliberative or participatory democracy, and if so, which should it be?
Okay, one question. I don't know, there's another one, then in the back. So let's just pass the cue to Alvaro and then in the back.
That's not bad.
Yes. Yeah, no, that's fine.
Okay, so in class, we have law course right now, and we did, don't laugh. We learned about the Hungary position in the future of Europe. So my question is, after the future of Europe, the different resolutions, do you think that all the ideas of the different member states were represented? And also if this kind of like resolution or like plan that they do for the future of Europe will influence the Euroscepticism movement that nowadays are happening in Europe, because Hungarian like aspirations were really weird. So yeah, okay, thank you.
Thanks a lot for the panel. Yeah, I have a question that maybe to Gaetan, that you mentioned about the visibility, and I link a little bit to what Marcus was saying about national MPs being involved. So I wonder whether you think that if you would go back, maybe you would involve more structurally national parliaments in the design of the conference. And we had just a panel before on the role of national parliaments in the EU, and where that would have increased the visibility of the discussions on the conference because national parliaments take it over. And yeah, so thanks.
Okay, and other comments or questions? Okay, then I want to do something a bit unconventional, and I have actually not thought what I want to do, but we wanted to do a discussion. We wanted to do this breakout group, but I see that the audience has really shrunk. Yeah? So I was wondering, so I was thinking we won't do that, but also have a more lively discussion right here before we feed back to the panelists. So we have questions for discussion, and I want to bring you in here. So who knew about the conference on the future of work before coming here? Okay, and we saw this. Yes. So everyone who did not know about the conference? Okay, there was still, but you can see that we have informed, and it's perfectly fine not to know. So you can see that many of the people in the audience know about European affairs, but still some haven't heard about the conference of Europe. And who was actually involved in the conference? Who was kind of involved? One person, and then, yeah, that's what we would also, a question that we had for discussion, I would like to give to the panelists here, which was, okay, we have the conference on the future of Europe, but we have many other tools to involve citizens into EU affairs. Could one link up the conference with some of the tools? We had the discussion yesterday that also very much builds on the question that Einhorn raised before, linking it, embedding it into the system, yeah, so national parliaments, etc. But how could we make sure? There are some very good ideas of how to make sure that the conference is not it's not a one-day thing, but it's not a one-off, yeah, so of including it already in deliberations before proposals, but how to make sure that it's also more part of the institutional system. Is there a way of making the link between that or linking it to other ways of involving citizens? So I'm just trying to bring some of the discussion questions right here back to the panel. And before I give the panelists the opportunity to respond, are you sure you have no more questions? You're sure? Also late in the day, we have not. Okay, so then let us maybe start with the other way around. Marcus Schroeder, any ideas, any questions that you picked up from the audience where you would like to reflect upon? What about the link to national parliaments? Does the ombudsman, for instance, work a lot with national parliaments? These kind of things.
No, the ombudsman doesn't work a lot with the national parliaments because the ombudsman is not really in the business of lawmaking, and she works a lot with other national institutions. That is the national ombudsman, and we look into how sometimes we look together with these national institutions how EU policies work on an administrative level from the member states' perspective and our perspective. But I do feel that aside from what the ombudsman does, I do feel that people have an expectation that national parliaments and national policymakers get more involved in these European questions. That's why I think it's very important to have that, to bring that to the national parliaments involved. As Ian said this morning, he described how national parliaments are involved at European level. So yeah, I do think that's an important point to link European and national politics a little more, and as opposed to what Daniel Freud said this morning. He said that things should stay a little apart from each other. So yes, I would say that would be an important thing.
thoughts to pick from?
So let's see, no specific order, okay? Let's maybe start with this question on the conference plenary, and I will just give you my opinion, of course, and I can say, you know, maybe specific time. I think you are correct that maybe things didn't go that well in the plenary, but let's be clear that at the end of the day, as Gaeta said, this was really probably the one or the most not part of this entire exercise. It was rather new to try to marry the representative and participatory tracks of the conference. And you could look at it as, well, you know, we do live in representative democracy, and now people have spoken, the decision makers go and do their work. But I'm not sure this was necessarily the purpose of the exercise. The purpose of the exercise, to some extent, one could say, was precisely to sort of bring the two closer together, citizens and their leaders, right? And so putting them in a situation where they have to exchange with each other, where they have to listen to each other, where they have to hear from each other, it's quite an interesting idea, right? At least theoretically. It hasn't worked perfectly in practice yet, we know that, but it's not a misguided concept or idea, okay? And by the way, the plenary didn't just include citizens and members of the European Parliament, it included representatives of all kinds. I mean, I don't remember off the top of my head all the numbers, but you also had national parliamentarians, you had civil society, you had young people, you had all sorts of stakeholders involved, okay? And from where I stand, I see this being done not just for the people, but I see it as something potentially useful also for politicians. Because politicians themselves have to be familiarized and they have to be introduced to these kind of exercises and to their benefits. They need to understand also and sort of be exposed to this kind of process as well a little bit more. So it's not just that the people need to kind of understand how politics works and how politicians behave, but also politicians need to get more of a hands-on experience with this type of exercises and with the people themselves. And in that sense, okay, it was clumsy exercise, but it was one step, okay? And we have to start somewhere. Perhaps what this shows, and one lesson that we can draw from it, is that maybe there has to be a process or some sort of mechanism put in place where the politicians learn about what participatory democracy means in practice. You know, maybe some sort of process of educating them. Okay, you can do it by throwing them at the deep end, like it happened in the plenary, or you can do it, you can prepare it. And the plenary experience shows that maybe this kind of preparation needs to happen also for politicians, not for citizens, okay? Obviously, the more these interactions happen, in my opinion, the better it is, the familiarity grows, and it can be beneficial, let's say, ultimately for both sides to become more aware of each other's positions. So I'm not sure that the conference was necessarily intended to be purely deliberative or purely participatory. I think the purpose was to kind of mix and match and draw on the best of potential of these different processes. There was a strong deliberative element in the plenaries. I mean, there was deliberation, and the deliberation was intended, as far as I understand it, in the context of the plenaries. Some deliberation, you can say, also occurred on the marketing of digital platform, to the extent that people could, you know, bring in different points of view. But if I study, my understanding of the plenary was meant to bridge and marry. So in that sense, it has fulfilled its purpose, or at least it has fulfilled the purpose of trying to do just that. Now, with regards to whether all the views have been represented, I think there's some discussion about how the selection has happened, and here a specialized agency was involved, Hunter, with whom the institutions work on our projects as well, and attention was paid that that the participants are representative of a series of characteristics in the wider electorate. And here I should mention that youth was actually an important criteria. Yeah, I think every panel had to, a third of each European citizen panel had to have young people under 25, which is interesting. Now, where Eurosceptic views properly represented, this was not, to my knowledge, a criteria for selecting participants, their views on the European Union, but I have participated in two of the panel discussions, or two sessions of some of the panels, and one online actually as well. And I can tell you that not everybody present necessarily was a Europhile. Some were more hesitant about Europe, whether it was because they didn't know enough, or whether because they had other reasons to hold those positions. I don't know to tell you now. But it wasn't like everybody present was necessarily pro-European. Now, of course, there tends to be a bias in the selection of participants for this kind of events. It's normally it's one of the criticisms that is being leveraged against this kind of exercises, that it tends to bring in people from a certain with certain particular views on Europe. And in that sense, critics would say, well, we're trying to sell cucumbers to the gardeners, you know. But the reality is that I didn't feel in the groups that I attended that everyone was on the same page with regards to all of these discussed. So I did feel that there was variety in the opinions of the participants, and I think in that sense, it's good. Of course, again, recruitment is something that is often discussed in terms of methodological terms for this exercise, and I think you can always do better, especially at this scale. But keep in mind, these citizens panels happen during a pandemic.
Yeah, that's what I was
saying. Pandemic, you know? I mean, it's, if you think about it, it's phenomenal that we managed to bring these people together to have this discussion. Some of and also it was the multilingualism of it. I would also emphasize it's something that I can touch on. It's incredible that we are at the stage with our technology that we can enable this kind of changes online on such a scale. So from this point of view, I'm probably in the camp of those who is less critical about who was there. But I know that there's some criticism, and I agree that we can always do better. Now, Hungary, I mean, I'm not even sure that when we speak of Hungary, we speak of Euroscepticism. I mean, it goes a lot beyond that, okay? It has to do also with a certain vision of what democracy means, which stand apart maybe with the mainstream. So it goes beyond whether we support or not European integration. The other thing to say, another point, I'm randomly choosing things on the level down. Could we link up conference with other tools out there? And I think I can refer to this one stop place where citizens could go and see the different ways in which they could engage with politics, and that's, I think, it's already interesting that you would actually have one place where you could go online and see the different mechanisms that are available, because there are quite a few of them. You know, you have European initiative, you have the ombudsman, you have different types of consultations that can take place. You have so it's a variety of them. It's good for citizens to be able to go somewhere where they see it directly. But I would say one way in which the conference or the idea of what happened in the conference, for example, the citizens panels or assemblies can link with existing tools. There is this proposal that has been circulated that perhaps, for instance, if a European Citizens Initiative proposal gains passes the threshold of 1 million signatures, and let's say it's in a position where it's a legitimate request from the side of citizens, or it's close to that threshold, it's sufficiently high in support in collective across member states that maybe these kind of proposals should be discussed also by, for instance, panel that the institution, the commission, in this case, probably puts together. So in that way, a European Citizen Initiative and a panel could be with each other. Of course, the details of such an arrangement we have to sort it out, but I've heard such ideas being particularly. Now, on the visibility issue, I would have comments, and I would say here that because we often speak, well, the communication strategy has to be better, and more money has to be invested into making it visible. But I would say that it's not just money and sort of communication strategies. It's also about political will, in a sense, to take it up. And it's not just political will on the side of the national parliamentarians, which could, for instance, now continue the lifespan of the conference part. For example, by speaking about different issues linked to the conference and its follow-up in the campaign for the upcoming European Parliament elections. It's also generally about governments and important political figures at the national level actually talking about what's going on about the initiative. And don't forget that what happened at the EU level is only part of the conference story, but member states themselves were in charge of actually carrying out events. So if they wanted to, there would have been enough scope to discuss them. And of course, it's also the responsibility of the media, I would say, which, I remember having an event at the EPC where somebody from Financial Times came to tell us, well, we're not going to follow the conference because unless there is controversial policy issue coming out of it, there's no interest to our audience. So, and when I tried to, on several occasions, when we tried to talk also about the value of the conference in terms of process, there was very little media reception to that. So it's also the responsibility of media, it's the responsibility of politicians. And to a certain extent, if I wanted to be a bit mean, I would say that, well, maybe they didn't want to give it enough visibility on purpose, because if nobody knows about it, then you can hide behind it. So let's not put all the eggs into the basket of the Commission and on communication, another communication document. And the very last bit that I would mention links to the complexity of the process that was mentioned, and the fact that when it will take 3 years and the conference itself is so complex and you have to draw things. But to a certain extent, it feels to me that that this is something that we not only have to accept, but we also have to understand why things are like that. Because the more you want to simplify it, you will have to do it at the expense of certain things you leave out of the process. If you do want to bring different stakeholders together, then the composition-wise, participants-wise, it will be complex. Inclusion comes with certain requirements. A proper, thorough process that doesn't just mean you put something into a black box and take something out of it will probably be to a certain extent complex. Of course, we shouldn't carry this extreme. But I think understanding that, yes, if you are to influence policy making, you need to understand that the decision-making process is one that will take 2 years from the time the Commission comes out with a proposal until it becomes law. So to a certain extent, I think we shouldn't bash too much the complexity aspect, but at the same time, of course, without necessarily aiming for it either. So just a little bit of caution maybe on that. I'm sorry, I spoke too much.
Don't worry, no? Get done. Many things, huh?
Yes, very good question. Thank you very much. I just wanted to say, because you mentioned again the importance of follow-up feedback, and I wanted also to say that we are planning an event to give feedback to the citizens, and we are very happy about that. It should happen on the 2nd of December, but now there is discussion, but whatever, it will happen. Well, we are thinking of having at the moment a political segment with politicians coming to give feedback, and a more policy focused segment with more policy experts explaining what's in the proposal and things like that. But it's still being built up, and what we want is that it remains interactive, that it's not like a top-down lessons from the institutions. And yeah, that's basically. So I of course, for the question on whether we are talking about citizen participation and deliberative democracy, it's definitely both. This is why I said at the beginning an unprecedented exercise of citizen participation and deliberative democracy. I think it doesn't refer exactly to the same thing. Citizen participation is usually, it's participatory democracy is usually used as the other foot of democracy when you put representative democracy. So on the one hand, you have either the political representative or the citizen who can participation, can take forms, it can be more than direct, it can be online, it can be offline. I would say it's a broader concept. A deliberative democracy brings in more the methodology. So how do you organize that citizen participation? And indeed, we cannot say that all of the elements of the conference were all following a deliberative model. I think the panels were clearly built up on the model of citizen assemblies with deliberative methods, deliberative expertise, etc. brought in there. And I think the plenary was meant to be a deliberative body as well. It was not a decision-making body. It was a body that was supposed also to take up the recommendations coming from the panels and also some ideas from the platform and deliberate together, dialogue together between very different kind of actors. And I agree with Corina that this was the major interest of the plenary, confronting these people who don't have the habit of talking to each other so much, certainly not in these kind of instances. But I must say that the deliberative aspects were more difficult to build up. I'm very transparent about it. In the panels, we had indeed some precedent. We could build on the basis of methods that have proven to work in different contexts of citizen assemblies. Multilingual, not so much, but at least at national local level, the plenary was completely unprecedented. And the fact that it happened in the parliament, and that it had a lot of MP and MEPs inside, meant that most of them would think they are in a parliamentary setting. And this was very hard for us to make them understand, no, you're not. You are doing something different here. And so, in fact, we built up a process while we were making it by adjusting from one plenary to the other, also adapting on the citizens' feedback. You know, the first time they were not happy with the way they had the speaking time that they had, etc. So we changed this. We made sure that they had more speaking time than the other to compensate the fact that they are not professional politicians. So I think this is a place that would be immensely interesting to dig in and see how can we make this kind of body work in a more collective and deliberative way. I think there were deliberative moments. I agree with Corina, especially in the working group, I think, because this was smaller format, less formal, and more. But yeah, there is certainly room to extend it. But I would say that for me, the plenary happened at a different moment. And for me, it's almost a tool to include in the follow-up phase, almost, because it's actually a moment where you bring the politicians and the citizens to talk to each other. So in fact, you prepare the ground for the follow-up. You increase the feasibility of these measures, these recommendations to actually be implemented, because then you have the buy-in of a lot of political entities. You have actually talked to the citizen about it, and it became their proposal and not only the citizens. So I could talk about all this for a long time, but I will stop here. And I think another element that you brought, Alvaro, by mentioning the national parliament, but I think it's broader than that. One of the big challenges we will have for the next experience is how you make sure to create the best link possible between what's happening at local, national level and pan-European. I think the platform was a good way to bring in all these elements, but perhaps we could think about, how we can improve these interactions so that people really recognize that the pan-European level is part of the same process and not just things that you put next to each other and that create a global together. So perhaps there is something to do about the local or the national initiative being a bit more linked to the panels, for example, in terms of topics, in terms of methods. I'm sure there are a lot of things to do there. At the same time, I also want to say, because I know a lot of experts in participation and deliberative democracy, they love the wonderful map where everything seems very rational and consistent, and listening to this and listening to this and then this and this. If you are in a process of citizen participation, I think you have to accept that there is an element of unknown, and because it's a bottom-up process, right? Bottom-up, by definition, you cannot control everything. And I have to say, for me, the panel was an amazing moment. The plenary was a learning process for me, because I wasn't sure about this citizen component. I was wondering, how does it work? Are they going to be lost in this? They're going to be completely dominated. And in fact, they were very, very prominent, active. I thought that there would be an enormous turnover, because there would have been 3 weekends doing the panels and then another 6 weekends doing the plenary. I thought at the end 50% would drop. Not 2 had to be 3 weeks. So I mean, this really shows something about citizens' participation, that when you actually trust the citizens, when you empower them, they become an asset and they really bring added value to a process. On the link between the different tools, it's obvious that this is something we need to bring in this next phase of citizen engagement we are preparing. Indeed, the one-stop online shop will be a good way, I think, first good way to do it, but I'm sure there are many other ways to think about it. I was mentioning the local and the national and European level, for example. We imagine bringing in, making sure that different actors work together to make sense of these different tools. I'm thinking, for example, that this one-stop shop, I'm hoping that the public consultations, which at the moment they are theoretically open to citizens, but there's many stakeholders answering. The questionnaire are quite technical, so I'm hoping also that the third space, this new deliberative, more citizens-friendly space, could also be linked to the public consultation, that it wouldn't be separate spaces. So for example, a service would launch a consultation more targeted at specialists and stakeholders, and would launch something maybe a little bit more accessible at the same time on the deliberative space, for example. You can think of many ideas like that. And finally, on Hungary, the diversity, yes, on every citizens participatory process that will be a voluntary one will have a bias that you can't completely suppress, right? You can do as much as you can in terms of communication to make sure that more people are targeted to be more inclusive. The only way to really ensure to have diversity that you can control a bit is the random selection, and I think in that way the panels have really brought something new in the sphere of new policy making. I can say, I can just tell you that we had 5 criteria which were important because these criteria normally Eurobarometer showed that the level of support of the EU are very much linked to the level of education, of socioeconomic background, etc. Normally, if your 5 criteria that we use, which is age, gender, geographical origin, which was both the nationality but also urban, rural, which is a very important factor also for EU attitude. The level of education, socioeconomic background, we should have a quite diverse panel also on EU attitude, and I agree with Corina that this is the impression that whether we need to have something, either a panel or a sub-criteria or something that would allow us to actually show the numbers to the person who criticized our panel is another issue that we are reflecting on now, but normally if the panel is well done, it should be diverse. And Hungary could express itself by many means. One was indeed what was happening in their country, and Hungary was one of the most active member states on the conference platform, and they had their representative also in the plenary. So for me, all the different political parties are represented as well. So there was at least the space to express themselves. Okay, I will stop here for now. Thank you so much. Would you like to?
Yes, I guess. Yeah, I also have a few things. This is a lot taking. So maybe I'll follow up on the Hungary thing / use Eurosceptic views and so on. So correct me if I'm wrong, but on the digital platform, everyone could post any ideas they had, right? And the moment when the most voted ones were taken as discussion points for the panels, right?
Not exactly. I mean, we were giving to the panels the regular report on what was happening on the platform, and the quantitative element of the vote was one element that was given to them as an information, but not only. We were also doing mind maps with everything that was going on, because we didn't want to give too much prominence to the votes, because it was not a quantitative platform. It was mainly a qualitative.
Okay, then my argument was still gonna stand out. Everyone could post anything, and I remember because the platform was launched, I was there for the day that goes what this is about. Especially on the migration field, there were a lot of people who were like talking about, how migration is terrible, don't do quotas, let them drown in the Mediterranean, basically. And these ideas at the end of the thing just got drowned out by more other ideas that were very more critical, more developed, more whatever you want to call them, more practical. I don't know, that had actually something to offer to discussion instead of just living an idea. Yes, more nuanced, thank you, yes. So I'm sorry, but if the Eurosceptics wanted to be such a heavy part of the discussion, maybe they should have worked harder to be part of the discussion. Like, it's not, the conference is not going to come to them, they have to come to the conference. And if they didn't, that's on them, in my opinion. Building Europe takes time, so does destroying it. So maybe they should have worked harder. Yeah, it is what it is. When it comes to deliberatory versus participatory, in terms of the conference, in Romanian, we have this expression, maybe Corina knows it. There is this thing called the ostrich camel, yeah, which is basically, this thing that is neither ostrich, not camel, but it's kind of both. And I feel like that doesn't apply only to the conference. I feel like it applies to the EU in general. And the European Union as this today is not something that was built in a day, in a week, in a month, in a year. It took 70 years of continuous building, expanding,
and so on. And by that means of doing it, it's not going to be uniform, it's not going to be super straightforward, it's going to have a mix of everything. And it's the way it is, and at the end of the day, what has to be done is just to look at ways to improve it, make it work better, and so on. And sometimes it requires us to be, an ostrich camel. Yeah. I think a lot of people wonder that about the US as well. In terms of media reception, actually, this is something because in the first workshop earlier today, we discussed about there not being really enough European media space, like a proper one. Instead, everything is kind of going to national media channels, which doesn't really help to bring the European perspective to things. And if things are not prioritized on a national level, then it just doesn't get to the wider public, right? So I think that's something that, at the end of the day, something that needs to be worked on, not necessarily by the institutions, but in general by everyone in Europe, to create a European media space, to be able to kind of offer a European perspective to citizens, to be as accessible as possible. And that also helps, of course, with the promotion of things like the conference on the future of Europe, for example. Okay, hold on, I have something more. So you were mentioning that the citizens were involved and they really kind of like shown in the plenaries and in the discussions. And I think that's something really important, like how involved the citizens were and how much they actually cared about the conference. I think that really kind of like helped the institutions to see that this is actually working. They like it. They're not bored, like maybe, yeah, we should do this again. So I think that also is kind of like, a two-way street, because if the citizens at the end of the day would have not been really interested in this process and just have dropped out of it, like, 60% of it would have been, you have to replace them. They have shown that maybe they don't care, but they showed that they care. And, that's important in democracy. You cannot do much without citizens wanting to do something. And when it comes to tools of participation, I think we discussed, you mentioned like citizens initiatives, more consultation, also allowed for like the not only stakeholders like lobbyists or organizations or something, just average citizens. But I think we have like this one tool that is maybe we're ignoring it a bit, maybe it's just at the back of our head, voting. It's a great way to shape policy, I think. The European elections are coming up in 2024. And I think at the end of the day, people want to see a specific course of action in European policymaking. At the end of the day, it comes to what you vote, and not only on the European level, because yes, you can vote an MEP that has a specific line of thought, but let's say you vote for, I don't know, something who is very pro-EU for the European Parliament, which is nice, great. But if you vote at home for like an Eurosceptic, they also have their own influence in the Council of Ministers, and that just ends up conflicting with what's in the European Parliament, and that creates a deadlock in policy making. So at the end of the day, and I'm taking here, of course, the pro-EU perspective, but at the end of the day, if people want to see an advance in policy making, they have to look both at national level and how that affects the European level, and also the European level when it comes to their voting power. And to end it, I have something specific I want to say. Maybe just also going just slightly back on the who participated in the conference, right? The composition. I wouldn't say just because the people in there were said. So the people in there said basically, they offered a lot of criticism, constructive one, if you will, to institutions and stuff like. We should expand the powers there. We should have a change here. Unanimity should be scrapped. This should happen. It was basically constructive criticism on what's going on in the EU and how things should be done, right? Just because I don't necessarily think that's being Europhile. I just think that's being a person with critical thoughts that is able to analyze the situation and see what needs to be done so things become better. And just because people in there didn't go and say, no, you know what, this is not working, we should just scrap the EU, like let's all separate and let's do this whole thing. And I think just because people didn't say that, it doesn't mean everyone in there was like, hey, EU is so amazing. Like, I think being critical of the EU does not make you a Europhile, and I think you can be critical of the EU without wanting to dismantle it. You can be critical of the EU
ways that make it improve and become better for everyone involved. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. On that very positive note, we will have coffee. So looking at the audience, we will not have, because we're a very small audience and we were able to debate, we can debate over coffee. We'll come back for the concluding remarks and we'll possibly end a bit early, but the sun is shining, so we can benefit from that. We're still here to be able to wrap up the day. We also had breakout groups, and Flavia and I shared these breakout groups. So we wanted to just reflect on the entire day, what we have been discussing and wrapping up. And at the very end, I want to thank certain people, so I should not forget that. But before we do this, the floor is to Flavia. Sorry?
No, because I saw Fabio there, but then this is not the wrap up of the last panel now.
No, this is just the wrap up of the day.
So, yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm special. No. So yes, I guess we're wrapping up. I'll try to be brief. So I think I should thank all of you. First of all, thank you for participating. Thank you for asking questions, being involved in the discussions. I think that's really nice, especially while having workshops. It's nice to not speak to a blank wall. So thank you for your participation. I think, based on what we discussed at the workshop this morning and based on the debates and everything that's been happening since, 10 in the morning today, it's been a long day. I think basically what I take as kind of like a takeaway is that, democracy is always kind of like work in progress. And so is the European Union and Europe. And it requires, everyone to be involved and participate and work together to come to like a common result that, we can be satisfied with and we can see it has a positive effect on, our lives and everything else going on. And I think when it comes to the conference on the future of Europe is like a first step for like even more democratic Europe. And I know I've been critical of some points of it as, sometimes you have to do to improve something. I think at the end of the day, I see it as a positive trend towards more participation in the European Union and further reducing the democratic deficit in the EU. So yeah. I guess so. Maybe I'll come to something.
Thank you so much. So why are we here together? We're here together because Campus Brussels organized this workshop together with the Young Federalists of Europe. That's why we thought it would also be nice for us to sit here together. So as is usual, and someone said in the coffee break, it's so nice to hear non-academic voices. So I obviously have a more academic voice. And so what am I going to do? I'm going to group this into 3 points. That's always my ambition. Apparently a table is more stable if it has 3 feet, but I've never seen a table or hardly ever seen a table with 3 feet, but whatever. So here come the 3 points. The topic of the workshop was giving democracy a new push in times of crisis. So at the very beginning of the day, we discussed crisis, and we also discussed crisis together in the breakout groups. So there was a discussion, a very critical discussion about the term crisis. On the one hand, people said crisis obviously now feed into each other, reinforce each other. Also democratic backsliding, some said this is also a facet of this crisis, but we can also see that democratic backsliding has been there, of course, before some of these crises hit. But definitely there is a reinforcement of certain tendencies in times of crisis. In the morning, we also had a debate about who wins from a crisis, a very simplistic debate, but is the executive upgraded? And then the idea was in the European Union, it's not necessarily the Commission who has won from this crisis or benefited from this crisis, if you can say so, but it is more the European Council who actually had to come in also in times of crisis. So it's not about winners and losers, but it's also about certain decisions having to be taken by certain actors. Then there was a lot of discussion, very good discussion about instrumentalization of crisis. that crisis can also be used and abused for certain purposes. When crisis, we cannot deal with this right now. This is something you can, and especially if we are in, if crisis becomes business as usual, we have to be careful not to use crisis as an excuse for not getting on with certain issues. At the same time, never waste a good crisis is also something we hear quite often. So crisis also definitely gives rise to certain measures that we would have not seen without the crisis. So I think one can still have a lot of debate about the effect of crisis and what crisis actually is. The second dimension of today's workshop was the role of parliaments. And at the very beginning of today, we heard the European Parliament is not yet a normal parliament. In academia, Natalie is no longer here, but in academia, we very often say that the European Parliament has at least normalized to some extent. Yeah, it is really involved in decision-making. But this morning, we also heard the European Parliament doesn't have the right of initiative. It should really have that right, but it creatively interprets its powers. We also heard, which I found very nice, that it's fun to be in the European Parliament because of the shifting policy coalitions, that you have much more room to decide on things rather than in a national parliament where you, as a so-called opposition member. Then there was also a lot of discussion of who do you represent in the European Parliament? And there we had the verdict of the discussion was more or less every member of the European Parliament would tell you something else, but it's also very much based on role conception of members of the European Parliament. And then the third point, which is about what we discussed this afternoon, which was about citizens. So citizens' involvement, citizens' initiatives, also, of course, the conference on the future of Europe, we discussed that a lot. And when listening to the discussion, I think a very important point that came across is it's in the eyes of the beholder whether you think this is a positive development or whether it could be even more positive or et cetera, et cetera. I think it's the standard against which you measure, if you can call it measure, but at which you measure what has been achieved. And if that's what I wanted to say with this very maybe not useful metaphor of glass half empty, glass half full, but what do you measure it against? And I still personally think that the Conference on the Future of Europe has made a lot of steps into territory that we would not think possible before. Of course, you can always improve and you can always go further, but I think it was a very creative process. And also we heard from the organizers how they tried to adapt the process during the duration of the conference. And imagine within a pandemic, I think you cannot stress that enough. And then but the most important takeaway from today's discussion, and we had a similar discussion already yesterday with Working on Europe conference, the context of a conference organized by Working on Europe Maastricht. What is done with this now? On the one hand, and we've heard a lot of measures to follow up. That's a very good thing. But on the other hand, also embed certain processes more into already existing procedures. Because what you see in the European Union, we have a lot of tools. We have a lot of mechanisms, but we should use these mechanisms. We should also try to possibly improve on these mechanisms and try to link these mechanisms in a meaningful way. So I'm very much also for consolidation of what we have and thinking of how we can bring this together rather than always thinking about what can we do next. That's not a negative comment about the Conference on the Future of Europe, but I think you can take these insights and link them to existing procedures and existing fora, for instance, national parliaments, etc. So yeah, just work on what we have and move forward with what we have. And moving forward, I want to now close today's conference. I want to thank everybody for being here until the end. We can, of course, still have drinks after this, but I want to thank everyone. I also want to thank all the people who came here from other venues, not from necessarily Brussels. And I want to, really thank the Young Federalists of Europe of working together with us on this. But I especially want to thank the campus team. They're around. And it's Tatiana Kaftea's last day. So she's actually going to work in Brussels. But it's her last day today. She has really always been, fed into all these events. Then together without Felix, we wouldn't have this relay thing in the first place. And he always worked in the background and contacted many of you. If you're a speaker, he was always in contact with you, not me. And then, of course, Melissa is the one that is also always working behind the scenes and also getting all the stuff out on Twitter. We talked about communication. Well, we need that as well as a campus. So thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day. And thank you so much for these great discussions, and we'll continue those. Thank you.